My boss laughed when I handed in my resignation. He told me good luck finding another job at my old age in a young man's world. I smiled, looked him dead in the eye, and said thank you for your wishes. As I walked out, he noticed the heavy metal suitcase I was carrying and demanded to know what corporate secrets I was stealing. When I opened the case and told him the brutal truth, his smug face went completely white. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to arrogant people who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Garrett. I am 69 years old, a proud African-American man who spent 40 years turning raw steel and code into technological marvels. I built an engineering legacy with calloused hands and sleepless nights. I also thought I had raised a son who understood the fundamental value of loyalty and hard work. I was entirely wrong. The quarterly review was in full swing inside the glass-walled boardroom of Apex Dynamics. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table presenting the new production yields I had optimized over the past 10 years. My microchips were the beating heart of their entire operation. Bradley, our 35-year-old chief executive officer, paced the floor in a tailored suit bought with other people's money. Bradley did not build this company. He inherited his position when an aggressive private equity board forced a hostile buyout, systematically replacing seasoned engineers with eager corporate sharks. Bradley stopped pacing and slammed his hand flat on the table, cutting off my presentation mid-sentence. He looked at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He announced to the entire executive board that the company was moving in a new aggressive direction. He stated my methods were outdated, my vision was obsolete, and my mandatory early retirement was effective immediately. The silence in the room was absolute. I looked across the table and saw my son Cameron. I had brought Cameron into this company, trained him, and mentored him so he could one day take over my division fairly. Bradley placed a hand on Cameron's shoulder. He announced that Cameron was officially stepping up as the new lead project manager. My own flesh and blood had conspired with a man who despised me to push me out of my own creation. Cameron kept his head down. He stared intently at the grain of the mahogany table, entirely refusing to meet my eyes. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man whose Ivy League tuition I had paid in cash through grueling double shifts at the rail yard, was now sitting silently while I was publicly executed. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or demand a pathetic explanation from the son who had just betrayed me for a corner office and a title. The anger burning in my chest was absolute, a cold fire forged by decades of discipline, but I kept my breathing perfectly steady. I reached inside the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded envelope. I placed my formal letter of resignation squarely on the table and pushed it toward Bradley. He picked it up and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He tossed the letter back onto the table like a piece of trash. He told me I was making a fool of myself by acting like I had a choice in the matter. He leaned in close, his face flushed with arrogance, and loudly wished me good luck finding another job at my age in an industry that only values youth. He said I should take up gardening, collect my meager pension, and leave the real corporate warfare to the adults. I looked at Bradley, then I looked at my son, who still refused to lift his gaze from his legal pad. I smiled, a calm, cold smile. I said, "Thank you for your wishes, Bradley. I will certainly enjoy my free time." I reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted a heavy silver metal suitcase. I placed it directly on top of the financial reports scattered across the table. The heavy thud of the solid metal hitting the wood made Bradley flinch. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sudden nervous confusion. Bradley stared at the suitcase, his eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. He pointed a trembling finger at the metal box and demanded to know what corporate secrets I was attempting to steal on my way out the door. He threatened to call building security and have me arrested for industrial espionage before I even reached the lobby elevator. I did not break eye contact with him. I reached out and unlatched the heavy steel clasps. They snapped open with a sharp, echoing crack that silenced the entire boardroom. I lifted the lid and spun the suitcase around so Bradley Cameron and the entire board of directors could see inside. It was completely empty. There were no hard drives, no stolen blueprints, no confidential files. Bradley looked confused, demanding an angry explanation for the empty case. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity. I informed him that I was not taking anything that legally belonged to Apex Dynamics. I explained that I had just walked out of the main server room on the ground floor before this meeting began. I told him I had simply removed my proprietary microchips from the central mainframe. The specialized microchips I had designed, built, and patented entirely under my own name a decade ago, long before his private equity firm ever bought this building. The color rapidly drained from Bradley's face as he realized the fatal error he had just made. He opened his mouth to shout an order, but before he could speak, a piercing mechanical siren erupted from the factory floor below us. The emergency warning lights flashed bright red through the glass walls of the boardroom. The automated manufacturing line, the entire financial lifeblood of the corporation, ground to a brutal, violent halt. The servers were permanently dead. I closed the empty suitcase, picked it up, turned my back on my son, and walked out the door while the alarm screamed behind me. The concrete walls of the underground parking garage amplified the harsh echo of my footsteps. I walked toward my 10-year-old sedan, the heavy silver suitcase swinging at my side. I did not need to turn around to know someone was following me. The frantic, uneven slap of expensive leather shoes on the pavement was unmistakable. Cameron was running. "Dad, stop walking right now." His voice bounced off the concrete pillars, loud and demanding, carrying the unearned authority Bradley had just handed him. I stopped and turned slowly. Cameron stood 10 feet away, breathing heavily. He looked immaculate in his $3,000 tailored suit, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his posture rigid. He did not look like a son seeking forgiveness for publicly betraying his father. He looked like a cornered executive. "You need to give me those server codes," Cameron stated, stepping closer. He extended his hand, expecting obedience. "You cannot simply shut down the entire manufacturing line. Bradley is losing his mind up there. The board is threatening to pull their funding." I looked at his outstretched hand, then up to his face. "The line belongs to Apex Dynamics," I replied calmly. "The microchips that run it belong to me. I simply took what was mine when I was dismissed." Cameron dropped his hand, his expression twisting from impatience to sheer panic. "You do not understand what you have done. Bradley promised me the vice president position and a $500,000 signing bonus today, but it was completely contingent on a seamless transition of your division. My bonus, my promotion, my entire future at this company depends on delivering your operating codes." He was not asking for my help. He was demanding my life's work to pay for his ambition. He was willing to strip me of my dignity, my career, and my intellectual property, all to secure a corner office and a pat on the back from a man who despised us both. "Your future," I repeated, letting the words hang in the damp garage air. I looked closely at the sharp cut of his lapels, the luxury watch gleaming on his wrist, the Italian leather shoes. "I paid for your future 30 years ago. Cameron rolled his eyes and let out an exasperated sigh. "Do not do this right now. Do not give me the rail yard speech." I worked double shifts at the Southside Rail Yard from 1982 until 1995. I continued, my voice steady, ignoring his interruption. I swallowed every systemic insult, every racial slur, every grueling hour of overtime. I wore boots held together by duct tape so I could pay your Wharton Business School tuition in cash. I ensured you graduated without a single dime of debt. I built the foundation you are currently standing on. Cameron stepped forward, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "You lived in the past. You are a relic, Dad. You built a foundation, but you do not know how to build an empire. Bradley understands the modern market. He understands aggressive growth. You were holding the company back, and you were holding me back. I designed the microchips that kept this company profitable through 3 separate recessions." I corrected him. "I held you up. I never held you back." "The market does not care about your past," Cameron snapped, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "And right now, neither do I. I need those server codes, Dad. Bradley will destroy my career before it even starts if I walk back upstairs empty-handed." I looked at the son I had raised, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The young man I had proudly watched walk across the graduation stage was gone. He had been completely consumed by the corporate machine, replaced by a hollow man who measured his father's worth entirely by his utility. "You will have to tell Bradley that your signing bonus is gone," I stated firmly. "The codes remain with me." I turned around and reached for my car door handle. "I'm not asking you, Dad," Cameron said. The sudden chilling drop in his tone made me pause. It was not the voice of an angry son. It was the voice of a predator. I turned back around. Cameron stood under the flickering fluorescent light, his face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. The panic had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated cruelty that made my blood run cold. "Whitney and I foresaw this exact problem," Cameron stated, adjusting his silk tie. "We knew you would be stubborn. We knew you would try to hold on to your precious patents." "What does your wife have to do with my engineering codes?" I asked, my grip tightening on the handle of the metal suitcase. Cameron pulled his mobile phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. 2 weeks ago, Whitney and I met with a private physician. We detailed your recent behavior, your forgetfulness, your sudden bursts of anger, your inability to manage complex technical systems. The doctor was very understanding. He signed a preliminary evaluation of severe cognitive decline. The concrete walls seemed to close in around me. My own son had fabricated a medical diagnosis to steal my life's work. We drafted a comprehensive medical and financial proxy. Cameron continued, his voice devoid of any human empathy. We have the legal paperwork ready to file. If you do not email me those server codes by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Whitney and I will activate the proxy. We will formally declare you mentally unfit to make your own decisions. We will take conservatorship over your estate, your finances, and your patents. He looked at me with absolute certainty, believing he had trapped me in an inescapable corner. You hand over the codes voluntarily or we take them legally, Cameron concluded. Enjoy your drive home, Dad. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the elevator banks, leaving me standing in the cold garage. He had laid out his entire strategy. He assumed a 70-year-old man would surrender to the threat of institutionalization. He assumed I was weak. I unlocked my car door and placed the empty metal suitcase on the passenger seat. I did not feel fear. I felt the terrifying, absolute clarity of a man who realized the war had already begun. I drove away from the corporate headquarters with the mechanical wail of the server room alarms still ringing in my ears. The leather steering wheel of my sedan felt familiar and grounding against my palms. Cameron's threat echoed in the confined space of the car, a fabricated medical proxy. My own son was preparing to declare me incompetent to steal the patents I built from scratch. I needed to reach my house, secure my original patent documents, and contact my legal counsel before Cameron could execute his fraudulent medical trap. I pulled into the long driveway of the estate I had purchased 30 years ago. The house was supposed to be empty at this hour. Instead, a commercial utility van was parked directly on my manicured front lawn. The heavy front doors were propped wide open. A thick cloud of white gypsum dust drifted out onto the porch. I stepped inside, and the deafening roar of a sledgehammer striking wood assaulted my ears. I walked down the main hallway toward the master suite. The space I had shared with Evelyn for decades was completely unrecognizable. A burly contractor in a heavy canvas shirt was violently swinging a sledgehammer into the southern wall, shattering the drywall into jagged pieces. Plaster coated the hardwood floors I had meticulously laid myself. Standing in the center of the destruction, wearing a pristine white designer dress and an arrogant smirk, was my daughter-in-law, Whitney. She held a digital tablet in one hand and pointed toward the walk-in closet with the other. She ordered the contractor to tear out the cedar shelving next. She did not even flinch when I stepped into the room. She simply tapped her screen and instructed the man to keep swinging. I watched the cedar planks Evelyn had picked out get ripped from the studs. Whitney was actively dismantling my sanctuary without a shred of hesitation. I did not yell over the noise of the destruction. I stepped forward, grabbed the contractor firmly by the shoulder, and pulled him back from the wall. The heavy hammer dropped to the floor with a loud thud. I looked directly at the stranger and told him to gather his tools. The contractor looked back and forth between me and Whitney, clearly confused by the sudden interruption. Whitney let out a sharp, condescending sigh. She stepped between us, crossing her arms tightly. She told the contractor to take a 10-minute break outside while she dealt with a minor familial misunderstanding. Once the man left the room, the silence left behind felt heavier than the noise. Whitney looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. She casually informed me that Cameron had called her from the parking lot. She knew I had paralyzed the manufacturing line. She knew I was refusing to hand over the server codes to Bradley. She stated that since I was making things difficult at the office, she was accelerating their timeline at the house. I asked her what gave her the authority to destroy my master suite. She smiled a hollow, predatory smile. She explained that Bradley required a sophisticated venue to host high-level corporate networking dinners. My estate was perfectly located for his elite clientele. She and Cameron were converting the entire main floor into an executive entertainment space. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the hallway leading to the basement stairs. She told me the main floor was no longer suitable for someone in my rapidly declining mental state. They were moving my belongings down to the basement. The basement was damp, entirely windowless, and isolated from the rest of the property. She framed it as a necessary medical precaution for my own safety. I maintained absolute stoicism. I informed her that she had no legal right to alter my property and commanded her to cancel the renovation immediately. I told her I would not allow another hammer to strike my walls and ordered her contractor off my land. Whitney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She adjusted her diamond earrings and stated that sending the contractor away would not save my money. She looked me dead in the eye and revealed she had already paid the construction firm a massive, non-refundable deposit. I asked her how she afforded such a premium firm. She smiled wider. She proudly announced she had completely drained my joint emergency banking account to fund the demolition of my own home. The joint emergency account was established 5 years ago purely as a precaution after my minor heart surgery. I had placed Cameron's name on the account exclusively to handle hospital bills in case I was ever incapacitated. I trusted my son to respect the boundary of that emergency fund. Whitney had just gleefully admitted to weaponizing my own safety net to finance my displacement. I realized the demolition was merely a distraction. If she had brazenly drained the joint account, they were likely targeting my primary assets. I turned my back on Whitney without giving her the satisfaction of an angry response. I walked swiftly down the corridor toward my private study at the rear of the house. Whitney called after me, her voice dripping with venom, warning me that avoiding the conversation would not stop the medical proxy they were preparing to file. I ignored her threats and locked the heavy oak door of my study behind me. The room felt disturbingly cold. I walked straight to the large oil painting of the harbor hanging behind my mahogany desk. I pushed the heavy frame aside to reveal my hidden wall safe. The digital keypad was completely smashed. The heavy steel door hung wide open, its internal locking mechanism brutally forced apart by a commercial drill. The violation was absolute. I dropped to one knee and inspected the empty steel cavity. Everything of value was gone. My leather-bound banking ledgers, which contained the routing numbers to my primary domestic accounts, were missing. The original property deeds to the estate and my commercial patents had been removed. But the financial theft was not the blow that made my chest tighten. I reached into the deepest corner of the safe, feeling for the small velvet box I had guarded for a decade. It was missing. They had stolen Evelyn's vintage diamond jewelry. The rings and necklaces my late wife had explicitly asked me to hold until I deemed Cameron responsible enough to pass them down to a deserving family. They had taken her memory to pawn for their corporate survival. They had stripped me of my financial armor and taken my most precious sentimental hostages. I stood up slowly, the cold reality of their total invasion settling into my bones. The ambush was complete. I needed to move faster than their greed. I stepped back from the violated safe and pulled my mobile phone from my suit jacket pocket. I did not waste time staring at the empty steel cavity or mourning the stolen heirlooms. Emotion is a luxury you cannot afford when your enemy is actively dismantling your life in real time. I dialed the direct executive extension for David, the senior branch manager at my primary financial institution. I had banked with his branch for 30 years. I knew his wife's name, I knew his golf handicap, and I knew exactly how to leverage his authority. When he answered the line, however, his voice lacked its usual warm professionalism. He sounded strained, nervous, and entirely defensive. I did not offer a greeting. I instructed him to execute an immediate total freeze on all my personal and joint accounts, citing suspected theft and unauthorized access by my son. David did not type on his keyboard. He let out a long, heavy breath into the receiver. He informed me with a trembling voice that he could not comply with my directive. My access to my own financial portfolio was officially denied. I stood perfectly still. I asked him for the specific legal justification for locking a man out of his own life savings without a formal court order. David explained that Cameron had walked into the branch lobby at exactly 9 o'clock that morning. My son did not come alone. He arrived flanked by a corporate attorney and presented a preliminary cognitive decline evaluation. The document was officially signed and stamped by Dr. Aris, a licensed and bonded medical professional. David sounded genuinely apologetic, but stated his hands were completely tied by rigid banking protocols. The document explicitly detailed severe memory loss, aggressive paranoia, and an inability to manage complex financial assets. Because Cameron was already listed on my joint emergency medical account, the bank's legal department approved an immediate temporary conservatorship. They transferred total control of my domestic liquid assets to my son pending a full judicial competency hearing. Cameron had weaponized the banking regulations designed to protect the elderly, turning them into a financial guillotine. He had legally erased my financial autonomy before I even walked into the boardroom to resign. He needed my money to fund his hostile takeover, and he used a corrupt doctor's signature to steal it with absolute impunity. I terminated the call without uttering another word to David. Arguing with a terrified middle manager bound by corporate policy is a profound waste of tactical energy. I placed my mobile phone face down on the edge of the mahogany desk. I stood in the center of the cold study and surveyed the wreckage left behind by my son. Cameron believed he had severed my oxygen supply by cutting off my domestic banking. He severely underestimated the man who raised him. I walked over to the heavy Persian rug covering the center of the hardwood floor and kicked it aside. Back in the early 1990s, when I was filing my first independent engineering patents, I faced relentless corporate espionage and systemic racial discrimination from investors who wanted to strip me of my intellectual property. I learned very early that a smart man never leaves his true leverage where his enemies can reach it. I knelt on the floor and pressed my thumb against a specific discolored knot in the oak floorboards. A hidden mechanical latch clicked open deep within the joists. I lifted the heavy false panel to reveal a small, dust-free compartment lined with lead. Inside sat a heavy encrypted satellite phone and a physical ledger bound in black leather. I powered on the satellite device. It bypassed all local cellular towers operating entirely off the grid to prevent any digital tracing. I dialed a heavily secured international number. The line rang twice before a crisp, accented voice answered. It was Neil, my private offshore wealth manager based in Geneva. Neil and I had done business together for over 2 decades. He handled the capital, the blind trusts, and the holding companies that Cameron Whitney and the rest of the world knew absolutely nothing about. I did not bother with pleasantries. I informed Neil that my domestic accounts were compromised, my son had initiated a fraudulent medical conservatorship, and my physical safe had been breached. I instructed Neil to prepare a massive financial counteroffensive. Neil did not sound surprised by the domestic theft, but the rapid tapping of his mechanical keyboard echoed loudly through the secure satellite connection. He asked me exactly what physical documents were taken from my wall safe. I listed the missing items with clinical precision. The banking ledgers, the vintage jewelry, and the original property deeds to my estate. The typing on Neil's end suddenly stopped. A heavy silence stretched across the connection. Neil informed me that the situation extended far beyond stolen cash and pawned diamonds. He told me the liquid domestic money was the least of my current worries. Neil had actively monitored the corporate financial registries surrounding Apex Dynamics all morning. He detected a massive irregular influx of capital moving through Bradley's corporate accounts. Cameron and Bradley did not just steal my physical deeds to keep them away from me. They used the stolen property documents paired with my forged signature and the fraudulent medical proxy to leverage my entire estate as collateral for a high-interest commercial bank loan. They secretly secured $5 million in emergency corporate funding. Neil explained the brutal mechanics of their strategy. The automated manufacturing line was dead. Bradley was hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars by the hour because he could not fulfill his global shipping contracts. He needed an immediate massive cash injection to keep the private equity board of directors from terminating him by the end of the week. Cameron provided my home as the sacrificial lamb to secure Bradley's survival. The terms of the predatory loan were absolute and unforgiving. Bradley had exactly 48 hours to restore the servers and resume factory production to begin repaying the principal. If I did not surrender the operating codes to my son, the company would default on the emergency loan. The commercial bank would immediately seize my estate to cover the $5 million debt. Cameron had deliberately tied my lifetime of engineering work directly to the roof over my head. He believed he had placed me in an inescapable checkmate. I had to choose between surrendering my intellectual property or losing my physical home to the bank. I thanked Neil for the intelligence, ordered him to stand by for my next directive, and ended the connection. I looked around my violated study, listening to the faint sound of Whitney's contractor swinging his hammer in the other room. Cameron thought he understood leverage. He was about to learn how a master builds a trap. I sat in the center of my violated study, the dust from the drywall demolition settling over the forced safe. The encrypted satellite phone was securely locked back inside the hidden floorboard compartment. I needed to wait for Neil to align the international legal maneuvers. Less than 2 minutes later, my standard mobile phone began to vibrate violently against the surface of the mahogany desk. The caller identification displayed the primary executive line for Apex Dynamics. I let the device ring 4 times before answering. I did not speak. I let the heavy silence force his hand. Bradley's voice came through the receiver, entirely lacking the arrogant venom he had displayed earlier in the glass-walled boardroom. He sounded completely out of breath, his cadence tight, rushed, and erratic. He attempted to adopt a tone of magnanimous compromise, addressing me by my first name as if we were old friends resolving a minor unfortunate misunderstanding. He informed me that the automated manufacturing line was still completely paralyzed. He admitted with a heavy dose of rehearsed corporate spin that the resulting downtime was causing significant logistical headaches for their global shipping partners and upsetting the private equity board. I knew the unvarnished truth. Neil had already confirmed the financial metrics. Apex Dynamics was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars by the hour, and Bradley was actively facing termination. Bradley shifted his approach, offering what he genuinely believed was a generous olive branch. He proposed a lucrative consulting arrangement to bridge the gap between my departure and Cameron taking over the division. If I drove back to the facility, immediately reinstalled the proprietary microchips into the main servers, and brought the manufacturing mainframe back online, he would retroactively cancel my forced retirement. He offered me $50,000 in cash as an immediate untaxed bonus. Furthermore, he promised to grant me the official title of Senior Technical Advisor. It was an entirely hollow title carrying zero actual authority and requiring no physical office, designed solely to keep me on a short legal leash while his engineers reverse-engineered my life's work. He genuinely believed a 70-year-old man facing displacement and irrelevance would leap at a fraction of his actual worth. He framed the pathetic bribe as a profound gesture of respect for my decades of loyal service. I listened to his entire proposal without interrupting, allowing him to construct his own verbal trap. When he finally stopped speaking, waiting eagerly for my profound gratitude and compliance, I delivered my answer with absolute unwavering calm. I told him I declined his offer. I stated that my dignity was not priced at $50,000, and I had absolutely no interest in advising a hollow corporate shell run by thieves. The silence on the line lasted for a fraction of a second before Bradley's facade of corporate diplomacy completely shattered. His heavy breathing turned ragged and aggressive. The polished young executive vanished, replaced entirely by a desperate cornered animal. He began to shout, the pitch of his voice rising until it echoed loudly through the receiver and bounced off the walls of my study. He accused me of destroying the company out of petty geriatric spite. He demanded the server codes, insisting that my actions had crossed the line from a simple labor dispute into outright criminal behavior. When I remained perfectly silent, refusing to engage with his escalating hysteria, Bradley launched his ultimate threat. He informed me that his private security team had already secured the perimeter of the factory floor. He claimed he had his legal department on standby, actively drafting a formal expedited complaint to federal law enforcement. He threatened to dispatch armed federal investigators directly to my estate before the sun went down. He promised to ruin my legacy by having me indicted on severe federal charges of deliberate corporate sabotage and domestic terrorism. He painted a vivid, cruel picture of me spending the last years of my life locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. He shouted that he had the capital, the board's backing, and the political connections to ensure I never saw the outside of a prison cell if the manufacturing line was not fully operational by midnight. He demanded absolute compliance, believing fear would accomplish what his pathetic bribe could not. I allowed him to finish his tirade. The echo of his frantic shouting faded into the static of the cellular connection. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that immediately silenced his breathing. I advised Bradley to summon his legal department immediately, not to file a federal complaint against me, but to urgently prepare his own criminal defense. I informed him that the microchips currently resting securely in my metal suitcase were not the intellectual property of Apex Dynamics. I explained the reality of the engineering timeline to him. 10 years prior, when the company was struggling to maintain basic operational liquidity and facing bankruptcy, I had approached the previous executive board with a radical new design for the automated manufacturing line. They had laughed at the proposal and formally refused to allocate a single cent of corporate research and development funding to my division. Therefore, I funded the entire massive project using my own private capital. I designed the complex architecture on my own time, built the physical prototypes in my own garage, and quietly filed the comprehensive patents exclusively under my own legal name. I had granted the company a temporary revocable license to utilize the hardware solely out of loyalty to the hardworking men on the factory floor who needed their paychecks. Bradley's breathing stopped entirely. I could hear the absolute terror paralyzing his throat as the realization set in. I delivered the final crushing blow. I stated that his hostile takeover of the company completely nullified my temporary licensing agreement. By continuing to operate the manufacturing line without my explicit legal consent, Apex Dynamics had been committing massive documented patent infringement for the entirety of his tenure as chief executive officer. He was not the victim of corporate sabotage. He was the perpetrator of intellectual property theft on a massive federal scale. The $50,000 bribe he had just offered me was a microscopic fraction of the millions he legally owed me in backdated royalties and punitive damages. Before Bradley could formulate a single word of defense, I heard the muffled sound of a door crashing open on his end of the line. I heard him frantically screaming at his lead corporate counsel in the background, demanding they pull the patent registry and verify my claims immediately. I did not wait to hear the lawyer confirm his absolute ruin. I terminated the call, severing the connection and dropping the mobile phone back onto my ruined mahogany desk. The boardroom was no longer my problem. Bradley was decapitated by his own ignorance. I turned my attention away from the phone and looked toward the hallway. The real war was marching toward my front door, dressed in a white coat. I stood in the center of my ruined study. The echo of Bradley's frantic screaming had faded from the room, replaced by the low hum of the central air conditioning and the distant rhythmic thud of Whitney's contractor swinging a sledgehammer into my master suite walls. My victory over the corporate executive was entirely absolute, yet it afforded me no time to rest. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway broke the silence of the estate. I walked deliberately down the main corridor, my shoes striking the hardwood floors that were now dusted with white gypsum powder. I reached the front foyer just as the doorbell rang. I did not check the security monitors. I knew exactly who was standing on my porch. I unbolted the heavy oak door and pulled it open. Cameron stood on the top step. His tailored suit looked slightly rumpled, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Beside him stood a man who looked distinctly out of place in a residential neighborhood. The stranger wore a sleek, overpriced charcoal suit that clung too tightly to his frame. His hair was slicked back, and he held a thick silver metal clipboard pressed firmly against his chest. He possessed the polished, hungry look of a corporate fixer rather than a medical professional. Cameron did not offer a greeting. He crossed his arms and looked at me with a manufactured expression of deep paternal concern. He announced that he had brought a medical specialist to conduct the in-home evaluation we had discussed in the parking garage. He stated that my recent behavior was highly alarming, destructive, and required immediate professional intervention. The stranger stepped forward, extending a hand adorned with a heavy gold watch. He introduced himself as Dr. Eris. His voice dripped with a rehearsed synthetic empathy designed to pacify frightened patients. He told me he was here simply to have a friendly conversation, to perform a routine cognitive assessment, and to ensure I was living in a safe mental state. I did not shake his hand. I looked at his polished shoes, then at his clipboard, and finally at his eyes. I told him he was trespassing on private property and ordered him to return to his vehicle immediately. Cameron stepped aggressively forward, attempting to force his way into the foyer. He told me I no longer had the authority to refuse medical treatment. I planted my feet squarely in the center of the doorway. I am 70 years old, but 40 years of hauling steel, lifting engine blocks, and climbing industrial scaffolding had forged a physical density that age could not easily erase. Cameron stopped dead in his tracks, instinctively recognizing the immovable wall standing in front of him. I looked directly at my son. I informed him that no medical proxy had been legally validated by a sitting judge, and therefore neither he nor his hired physician had any legal right to cross my threshold. Dr. Eris dropped his synthetic smile. The mask of a caring healer vanished, instantly replaced by the aggressive arrogance of a man accustomed to bullying the elderly. He stepped directly in front of Cameron, closing the distance between us until his expensive cologne invaded my personal space. He attempted to use his physical presence to intimidate me, leaning forward to peer down his nose. He informed me that my refusal to cooperate was a textbook symptom of severe paranoia and advancing dementia. He raised his silver clipboard and tapped it with a heavy gold pen to emphasize his authority. Eris stated that if I did not step aside and allow him to conduct his evaluation inside my living room, he would execute his secondary protocol. He threatened to call the local police department immediately. He explicitly promised to inform the dispatcher that an elderly man was experiencing a violent psychiatric episode and posed an active immediate danger to himself and his family. He outlined the brutal reality of an involuntary psychiatric welfare check. He described how uniformed officers would arrive, place me in handcuffs, and drag me out of my own home in front of my neighbors. He warned me that once I was institutionalized under a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold, Cameron would have absolute legal leverage to finalize the permanent conservatorship. The doctor smiled a cold, triumphant smile. He told me I could either walk back into my living room with dignity or be dragged out of my house like a criminal. He demanded I make my choice. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked onto the face of the corrupt physician standing on my porch. As I studied the sharp angles of his jaw and the distinctive surgical scar near his left eyebrow, a crucial piece of financial intelligence clicked into place. 5 years ago, Neil had compiled a comprehensive, highly classified dossier on the private equity sharks attempting to circle my patents. An engineer always maps out the structural weaknesses of his environment, and Neil's investigation naturally extended to the network of corrupt professionals these executives utilized to clean up their messes. I remembered the specific file bearing the name Aris. He was not a respected neurologist. He was a disgraced prescription mill doctor who catered exclusively to desperate executives and covered up their liabilities. I remained perfectly still in the doorway. I let the heavy silence stretch until the doctor's confident smile began to waver. I leaned forward, closing the final inch of space between us. I bypassed Cameron, entirely focusing my absolute attention on the hired gun. I did not shout. I lowered my voice to a sharp, quiet whisper, meant only for his ears. I asked Dr. Aris how the weather was in Macau. I mentioned the exact name of the unregulated offshore syndicate that currently held his massive outstanding gambling debts. I listed the specific sum of $250,000. I quietly informed him that the violent men holding his markers were actively looking for him, and they would be highly interested to know he was currently doing high-paid mercenary work in the suburbs while completely ignoring his crushing financial obligations. Dr. Aris froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His breathing halted entirely. The hand holding the heavy gold pen began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. His eyes widened in absolute naked terror as he realized the old man he was hired to institutionalize possessed the exact coordinates of his impending destruction. His fingers went entirely numb. The heavy silver clipboard slipped from his grasp. It hit the concrete porch with a loud metallic clatter, scattering the fraudulent medical evaluation forms across the ground. Cameron jumped back, completely bewildered by the doctor's sudden physical collapse. I looked at Aris and quietly asked if he still wanted to call the police. The heavy silver clipboard clattered loudly against the concrete porch, scattering the fraudulent medical evaluation forms across the ground. Cameron flinched violently, completely bewildered by the sudden physical collapse of his hired mercenary. I did not give my son the opportunity to ask questions. I reached out, grabbed the lapel of Dr. Aris's overpriced charcoal suit, and yanked him forcefully across the threshold. I slammed the heavy oak door directly in Cameron's face and threw the deadbolt. The loud mechanical click echoed through the foyer, sealing the doctor inside my domain. Aris was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the space as if looking for an emergency exit. I did not give him time to recover his breath. I shoved him forward, directing him into my living room. The hardwood floors and expensive furniture were still coated in a fine layer of white gypsum dust from Whitney's aborted demolition project. I pointed to a deep leather armchair sitting in the center of the debris. I ordered him to sit. He collapsed into the chair, his posture rigid with sheer, unadulterated terror. I stood directly over him, blocking out the light from the bay window. Outside, I could hear Cameron pounding his fists against the thick oak door, shouting my name and demanding to know what was happening inside. I ignored the noise completely. I focused my absolute attention on the sweating physician trembling in my chair. I demanded the exact truth behind the cognitive decline evaluation he had signed. I wanted to know the specific timeline, the exact amount of money exchanged, and the specific parameters of the medical conservatorship my son had tasked him to fabricate. Dr. Aris desperately attempted to summon his professional arrogance. He straightened his tie with shaking fingers and tried to hide behind a sudden pathetic defense of medical ethics. He stammered that his patient confidentiality agreements prevented him from discussing any medical documentation with a hostile party. I leaned closer, stripping away his remaining illusions. I informed him that medical ethics do not legally apply to forged documents designed to steal a man's entire estate. I asked him again how much Bradley and my son had paid him to diagnose me with severe dementia without ever placing a stethoscope against my chest. Dr. Aris swallowed hard, his eyes shifting nervously toward the front door. He attempted to call my bluff. He forced a weak, synthetic laugh and stated that throwing around vague rumors about gambling debts proved absolutely nothing in a court of law. He told me I was merely a retired, obsolete engineer who had no fundamental concept of how the real world operated. He warned me that if I did not unlock the door immediately, Cameron would summon the local police and my aggressive behavior would perfectly validate the exact psychiatric diagnosis he had drafted. I did not raise my voice in response to his hollow threats. I turned my back on him and walked slowly toward the large bay window. I pushed the heavy drapes aside. I watched Cameron stop pounding on the door and pace angrily down the driveway toward his luxury sedan, furiously typing on his mobile phone to alert Bradley of the complication. I kept my gaze fixed on my son's car outside and spoke over my shoulder. I told Dr. Aris that he had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation regarding my financial literacy. I explained that spending 40 years designing complex manufacturing systems teaches a man exactly how to identify deep structural decay. When the global financial markets collapsed in 2008, I did not panic like the rest of the country. While arrogant corporate executives were desperately leaping from windows and liquidating their assets for pennies, I was aggressively positioning my capital. I utilized a highly complex network of anonymous offshore shell companies managed entirely by Neil. I spent the recession quietly purchasing the distressed debts of desperate men. I walked him through the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the secondary debt market. I explained how bad paper generated by severe gambling addictions inevitably gets sold to ruthless offshore syndicates in places like Macau. I detailed how those specific syndicates occasionally bundle that toxic debt and sell it to private holding firms to clear their own ledgers. I turned away from the window and faced the doctor. I watched the last remaining drops of color drain from his face as the realization of his predicament finally set in. I informed him with freezing precision that my primary offshore holding firm had purchased his specific bundle of toxic debt exactly 11 months ago. Eris gripped the leather armrests of the chair, his knuckles turning stark white under the pressure. I did not stop there. I systematically dismantled his entire life. I detailed the secondary commercial mortgage on his private medical clinic. I listed the specific legal liens placed against his state medical license to secure those massive offshore loans. I told him I effectively owned his medical practice, his professional reputation, and his immediate physical freedom. I delivered my ultimatum with an absolute terrifying calm. I told him he had exactly 2 minutes to make a choice. He would immediately provide a sworn, recorded affidavit detailing the exact parameters of the medical fraud orchestrated by Cameron, Whitney, and Bradley. He would surrender every piece of digital communication proving the conspiracy, and he would serve as my primary cooperating witness in federal court. I laid out the alternative. If he refused my generous offer of cooperation, I would instruct Neil to execute the aggressive debt collection protocols immediately. The offshore syndicate would legally liquidate all of his physical assets by nightfall. I would personally ensure the state medical board received his forged evaluation of my health, guaranteeing he would face mandatory federal prison time for grand medical fraud by the end of the week. He would lose his clinic, his license, and his life today. Dr. Aris stared up at me entirely broken. The last shred of his arrogant, polished defiance evaporated into the dusty air of the living room. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He began to weep quietly, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his total ruin. The sound of his crying was pathetic, a stark contrast to the confident corporate fixer who had tried to intimidate me on my front porch 10 minutes prior. His trembling hand reached slowly inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his sleek mobile phone. He looked at the device for a long moment, swiped his thumb across the screen to unlock the security passcode, and placed it onto the glass coffee table. He pushed the illuminated device slowly across the glass until it rested directly in front of me. He looked up with terrified, bloodshot eyes. He whispered that he did not want to go to federal prison. He told me that every piece of evidence I needed to destroy Bradley and my son was right there on the screen. I picked up the illuminated device from the glass coffee table. Dr. Aris remained perfectly frozen in the leather chair, his breathing shallow and rapid, terrified that any sudden movement might trigger the destruction of his life. I did not look at him. I focused my attention on the glowing screen of his smartphone. I navigated past the standard applications and opened a secure encrypted messaging platform disguised as a generic utility folder. Inside the application, pinned to the top of the interface, was an active group chat labeled under the alias Project Apex. There were 3 participating numbers in the digital log. I immediately recognized the first as Bradley's direct executive cellular line. I knew the second number belonged to my son Cameron. The third number, the one driving the vast majority of the tactical directives and aggressive scheduling, belonged to my daughter-in-law, Whitney. I scrolled back through months of heavily encrypted text logs and voice notes. The timeline of their digital conspiracy aligned perfectly with my initial refusal to hand over the proprietary server codes. I read the raw, unfiltered transcript of my son's descent into corporate treason. The messages revealed a truth I had not anticipated. Cameron was not the architect of my destruction. He was merely the blunt, easily manipulated instrument. In the early weeks of the chat history, Cameron expressed deep, recurring hesitation regarding their strategy. He typed long, agonizing paragraphs questioning the morality of declaring his own father mentally incompetent. He worried extensively about the potential legal blowback and the public optics of a forced institutionalization. He stated explicitly in multiple messages that my mind was sharper than his own, warning the group that a fabricated medical proxy would never hold up to intense judicial scrutiny. He pleaded with Bradley to find a standard financial buyout instead of pursuing the hostile medical route. I stood in the silent, dust-covered living room and watched my son's digital conscience fight a losing battle against relentless, calculated manipulation. Every time Cameron attempted to pull back from the edge of the conspiracy, another participant in the chat aggressively pushed him forward, silencing his doubts with surgical precision. It was Whitney who systematically dismantled his reservations. Her messages were clinical, ruthless, and entirely devoid of any familial loyalty. She weaponized Cameron's deep-seated insecurities against him. She reminded him relentlessly of his stagnant position at the company, highlighting Bradley's looming threat to terminate him and strip away his stock options if he did not successfully deliver my patents. She was the one who researched and located Dr. Eris. She personally negotiated the doctor's illicit off-the-books fee to fabricate the cognitive decline evaluation without ever requiring a physical examination. But the most damning revelation was not her psychological manipulation of my son. It was her independent, clandestine side negotiation with the chief executive officer. I backed out of the main group chat and found a separate direct message thread strictly between my daughter-in-law and Bradley. Whitney was playing a completely different, infinitely more lucrative game behind her husband's back. She promised Bradley the guaranteed, uncontested delivery of my proprietary microchip patents. In exchange for securing the intellectual property that would save his failing company, Bradley agreed to a massive corporate bribe. He promised to appoint Whitney to the executive board of directors immediately following my forced institutionalization. Furthermore, Bradley had authorized a secret, untraceable transfer of $1 million directly into an offshore financial account established solely in Whitney's name. I read the digital confirmation of the wire transfer. The money had cleared 3 days ago. Cameron knew absolutely nothing about the promised board seat. He knew absolutely nothing about the $1 million cash payout secured in a foreign bank. Whitney was actively selling out her husband's inheritance and her father-in-law's freedom to secure her own independent corporate empire. She was using Cameron as the disposable legal fall guy for a massive federal fraud conspiracy. If the authorities ever investigated the medical proxy, Cameron's signature was on the documents. He would take the entirety of the legal impact going to federal prison, while Whitney collected the ultimate financial reward and walked away completely untouched. She had weaponized her marriage for corporate capital. I did not waste a single second processing the emotional weight of Whitney's profound betrayal. Emotion is a vulnerability during an active operation. I connected the doctor's mobile phone to my secure desktop server hidden inside the credenza and initiated a total data extraction protocol. I forwarded the entire encrypted chat history, the damning audio logs, the medical forgery agreements, and the offshore financial transfer receipts directly to Neil in Geneva. The digital evidence was immediately locked behind impenetrable international firewalls completely out of reach of Bradley's corporate legal team. I systematically wiped the physical device clean, restoring it to its factory settings, and tossed the useless piece of plastic back onto the glass coffee table. I looked down at Dr. Eris. I pointed a single finger toward the hallway leading to the rear kitchen exit. I told him to leave my property immediately, abandon his clinic, and never return to this state if he wished to remain out of federal prison. The disgraced physician scrambled out of the deep leather chair, stumbling over his own expensive shoes as he sprinted toward the back door like a terrified, hunted animal. Before the heavy rear door even clicked shut behind him, a deafening explosion of shattering glass erupted from the front foyer. Cameron had retrieved a heavy steel tire iron from the trunk of his luxury sedan and smashed directly through the reinforced glass pane of the front door. He reached his arm blindly through the jagged shards, unlocked the interior deadbolt, and stormed violently into the living room. His tailored suit was covered in glittering glass fragments. His face was flushed with blind rage. He gripped the tire iron tightly and demanded to know what I had done with his medical specialist. I did not raise my voice. I did not adopt a defensive posture. I walked calmly over to the wireless laser printer sitting silently on my credenza. I retrieved a thick stack of warm, freshly printed pages containing the complete, unedited transcripts of the chat logs. I stepped deliberately across the gypsum dust covering the hardwood floor and stopped inches from the heavy steel weapon in my son's hand. I handed the printed papers directly to him. I told him to read his wife's private corporate negotiations. Cameron snatched the pages aggressively, ready to tear them apart. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the highlighted text. I watched his furious, arrogant expression slowly dissolve into absolute hollow devastation as the reality of the text messages finally registered. The tire iron slipped from his grip, hitting the floor with a heavy thud as he realized his wife had played him for an utter fool. I stepped over the heavy steel tire iron resting on the floorboards and left Cameron kneeling in the thick gypsum dust of his own shattered marriage. 2 nights later, the fragile illusion of their corporate victory was put on public display. Bradley and Whitney co-hosted an incredibly lavish charity gala at the Grand Atrium in the city center. The opulent event was entirely funded by Apex Dynamics Capital, strategically designed to publicly celebrate their new corporate partnership and project an image of absolute unshakable stability to the panicked private equity board of directors. I arrived at the venue precisely at 8 o'clock. I wore a bespoke midnight blue suit I had tailored in London a decade ago, a garment I reserved exclusively for formal, decisive declarations of war. The main entrance to the grand ballroom was heavily guarded by a premium private security firm. 4 broad-shouldered men with coiled acoustic earpieces stood behind a heavy velvet rope, meticulously checking digital invitations on illuminated tablets. I bypassed the long, winding line of wealthy socialites and walked directly toward the main double doors. The lead security director stepped squarely into my path, pressing a heavy, uncompromising palm against my chest. He possessed the rigid, humorless demeanor of a former military contractor paid to resolve complications quickly and quietly. He coldly informed me that the event was strictly invitation only and my name was nowhere on the registered guest list. He instructed me to step back from the entrance immediately or face swift physical removal from the premises. I maintained my posture, refusing to yield a single inch of ground to a hired mercenary. I looked at the security director and noted the specific gold emblem of the host charity pinned to his wide lapel. The organization was dedicated to funding pediatric surgical wards across the state. Bradley and Whitney had chosen it specifically because it provided the ultimate optics for their manufactured corporate philanthropy. They deliberately used sick children as a moral shield to deflect attention away from their massive intellectual property theft. The security director leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a gravelly, violent threat, warning me that he would not ask nicely a second time. I did not argue with the security director or attempt to force my way past his defensive line. I simply reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and retrieved a solid metal platinum donor card. I held the heavy engraved rectangle directly up to his face so he could read the inscription. The card bore no personal name, only a unique alphanumeric identification sequence and the gold crest of the charity's exclusive Founders Circle. I informed the guard that while Bradley and Whitney were currently utilizing the charity for a temporary public relations stunt, I had quietly established the organization's primary financial endowment 20 years ago using my anonymous offshore capital. My silent contributions completely subsidized the foundation's annual operating costs, making me the ultimate benefactor of the venue he was currently guarding. The security director stared at the platinum card. He recognized the highest tier of authorization immediately. His aggressive posture completely dissolved. He lowered his hand, unclipped the heavy velvet rope, and stepped respectfully aside to grant me unimpeded access. I walked through the heavy double doors and stepped into the sprawling ballroom. The space was an obscene display of manufactured wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of circular tables draped in imported silk. A live string quartet played softly in the far corner, their music entirely drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the hollow, nervous laughter of corporate sycophants. I moved deliberately across the polished marble floor. I did not rush my approach. I let the sharp, rhythmic click of my leather shoes announce my arrival. The crowd parted naturally, instinctively, sensing the cold gravity of my purpose. I walked directly toward the elevated head table at the far end of the room. Bradley stood at the center, holding a silver microphone, his face flushed with expensive wine and unearned arrogance. He was halfway through a self-congratulatory speech praising Whitney's innovative vision and officially welcoming her to the Apex Dynamics Executive Board. Whitney sat beside him wearing a triumphant predatory smile and a diamond necklace she had undoubtedly purchased with her newly acquired offshore bribe. They believed their positions were unassailable. They believed they had successfully discarded me. Bradley's voice faltered mid-sentence as he finally spotted me approaching the dais. His confident, practiced smile completely collapsed instantly, replaced by a sudden, rigid terror. The silver microphone let out a sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback as his hand began to shake uncontrollably. Whitney noticed his sudden paralysis and turned her head to follow his line of sight. Her triumphant expression shattered into pieces the moment her eyes locked onto mine. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. A heavy, suffocating silence swept across the entire ballroom as hundreds of wealthy guests turned in their seats to watch the confrontation. I stepped up to the head table. I did not yell. I did not create a scene or offer a dramatic speech to the captivated audience. I picked up a crystal carafe of sparkling water resting near the lavish floral centerpiece and calmly poured myself a glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the sheer tension stretch until the air in the room felt entirely unbreathable. I set the crystal glass down and looked directly into Whitney's eyes. The predatory confidence she had displayed while tearing apart my master suite was entirely gone. She sat frozen in her expensive chair, her knuckles turning stark white as she gripped the silk tablecloth. I reached inside my jacket and withdrew a thick, sealed manila folder. I dropped the heavy document directly onto her pristine porcelain dinner plate. The loud slap of the paper against the ceramic echoed loudly through the silent, cavernous room. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat on the edge of the table. I kept my voice pitched low, forcing her to lean in to hear the exact mechanism of her destruction. I informed her that she had severely miscalculated the reach of my offshore capital. While she was busy hiding Bradley's $1 million bribe in a generic foreign account, I had instructed Neil to trace the complex web of her personal liabilities. I found the aggressively leveraged mortgage attached to the luxurious coastal summer home she prized above all her other material possessions. My holding firm had purchased that specific debt portfolio yesterday afternoon. The document resting on her plate was not a warning. It was an immediate court-ordered foreclosure notice. I told her the locks on her summer estate had already been changed, her expensive belongings were currently sitting in boxes on the front lawn, and the property would be sold at a public auction by the end of the month. I stepped back from the table, leaving her staring at the manila folder in absolute silent horror. Whitney stared at the thick manila folder resting on her porcelain dinner plate, as if it were a live incendiary device. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the massive crystal chandeliers. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The devastating reality of the foreclosure notice shattered her meticulously crafted illusion of untouchable wealth. Bradley, standing beside her, finally recovered from his initial shock. The chief executive officer realized that the absolute authority he wielded within the walls of Apex Dynamics meant absolutely nothing to the man standing across the table. His public relations triumph was actively dissolving into a humiliating spectacle in front of the city's most influential private equity investors and socialites. Bradley's face flushed a deep, volatile crimson. He dropped his pretense of diplomatic grace. He slammed his fist onto the silk tablecloth, rattling the expensive silver cutlery, and pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. He did not politely ask me to leave the premises. He screamed into the silver microphone, projecting his frantic rage across the sprawling ballroom. He announced to the frozen crowd that I was a bitter, terminated employee suffering from a severe, undocumented psychological breakdown. He labeled me a trespassing lunatic who had violently forced his way into a private corporate charity function to harass his executives. Bradley locked eyes with the security director standing near the main entrance and issued a harsh, unfiltered command. He ordered his premium private security team to physically drag me out of the building and throw me onto the street. 4 broad-shouldered guards immediately broke away from their perimeter stations. They moved swiftly across the polished marble floor, their heavy boots echoing against the suffocating silence of the room. They fanned out in a tactical formation, attempting to surround me and cut off any avenue of escape. I did not retreat a single step. I calmly adjusted the cuffs of my midnight blue suit and kept my gaze locked firmly on Bradley. I knew exactly what was ticking down on the clock. The lead guard reached out his massive hands, aiming directly for my shoulders to forcefully restrain me. He never made contact. A deafening metallic crash echoed through the venue as the heavy double doors of the grand ballroom burst violently open. The sheer force of the impact violently threw the heavy wooden doors against the interior walls, shattering the brass hinges. The 4 private security guards froze instantly, their hands dropping to their sides as they turned toward the sudden explosive disruption. Stepping through the ruined threshold was Neil. My offshore wealth manager wore an immaculate charcoal overcoat, projecting the cold, calculating authority of a man who dismantles international financial empires for a living. He did not come alone. Flanking Neil in a tight, impenetrable V formation were 12 armed United States federal marshals. Their dark tactical gear and heavy utility belts created a jarring, aggressive contrast against the imported silk and lavish floral arrangements draped over the gala tables. The visual impact of federal law enforcement invading an elite corporate charity event was absolute. The wealthy guests scrambled backward in a blind panic, pulling their chairs away from the main center aisle to avoid the advancing line of armed officers. The air in the ballroom grew thick with genuine, unadulterated terror. The lead marshal, a tall man with a rigid jawline and a silver badge gleaming prominently under the chandelier light, did not offer a polite greeting. He barked a single, sharp command for everyone in the room to remain exactly where they were. The private security team, instantly recognizing the immediate legal authority and the overwhelming firepower of the federal agents, backed away with their hands raised in complete compliance. The marshals marched in perfect unison down the center of the room. They bypassed me entirely, not offering a single glance in my direction. Their boots cracked rhythmically against the marble floor, creating a steady drumbeat of impending justice. They moved directly toward the elevated head table. Bradley watched the tactical team ascend the carpeted stairs of the dais. The arrogant crimson flush vanished from his face, replaced by the sickly pale complexion of a cornered criminal. He took a stumbling step backward, colliding heavily with the edge of his own chair. He desperately looked toward the private equity board members seated in the front row, silently begging for an intervention that would never materialize. Neil ascended the stairs directly behind the federal agents. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked down at the chief executive officer with clinical detachment. Neil carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio under his arm, holding the physical culmination of every encrypted financial trace we had extracted from the corrupted physician's mobile phone. The corporate siege had officially shifted into a federal mandate. The lead federal marshal stepped directly in front of the chief executive officer. He did not ask for permission to speak or offer any professional courtesies. He withdrew a thick stack of legally binding documents bearing the stark, undeniable seal of a federal district court judge. He announced in a voice that carried to the furthest corners of the silent ballroom that he was serving an immediate, non-negotiable federal injunction. He explicitly detailed the severe charges facing the corporation. Apex Dynamics was formally accused of massive, premeditated intellectual property theft and systematic multi-year patent infringement. The marshal stated that all corporate assets, including the $5 million emergency commercial loan secured through fraudulent medical proxies, were instantly frozen by the federal government. The automated manufacturing line would remain permanently dead, and the company accounts were legally locked pending a massive, multi-agency federal investigation. Bradley was legally barred from entering his own corporate headquarters or accessing a single cent of the company's operating capital. Bradley's breathing became erratic and incredibly shallow. The walls of his corporate empire were collapsing in real-time, broadcasted live to the very investors he desperately needed to impress. Panic is a highly effective solvent. It instantly dissolves any remaining illusion of loyalty or corporate solidarity. Bradley realized he was staring directly at a lengthy federal prison sentence. Like a drowning rat desperate for a piece of floating debris, he immediately turned on his co-conspirators. He snatched the silver microphone from the table with trembling hands. He desperately shouted to the marshals and the stunned crowd that he was entirely innocent. He screamed that he had been maliciously deceived and manipulated by his own rogue executives. Bradley pointed a shaking finger directly at Whitney, who sat paralyzed beside her foreclosure notice, and then at Cameron, who had just stepped into the ballroom from a side service entrance. He publicly announced that Whitney had orchestrated the entire medical fraud and hidden a $1 million corporate bribe in a secret offshore account. He loudly declared that Cameron had falsified the engineering reports and lied to the board of directors about owning the proprietary microchip patents. In a frantic, pathetic bid to save his own reputation and avoid federal handcuffs, Bradley screamed that Cameron was officially terminated effective immediately. He severed all corporate ties publicly, firing my son and burning his wife in front of the city's most powerful elite. The ultimate betrayal was executed not by me, but by the very man they had sold their souls to serve. I stood quietly on the marble floor, watching their entire fraudulent structure burn to ashes. The grand ballroom erupted into a frenzy of panicked socialites and cornered executives as the federal mandate was delivered. The marshals immediately locked down the main exits to secure evidence and detain the primary conspirators, but I was not a target of their investigation. Neil had meticulously ensured my name was cleared from the operational sweep. I turned my back on Bradley, who was currently being pushed forcefully against the silk-draped head table, and read his Miranda rights. I walked smoothly through the bewildered crowd, my leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor with the steady, unrelenting rhythm of a metronome. The crisp night air hit my face as I exited the grand atrium, providing a sharp, welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of corporate greed inside the venue. I moved deliberately toward the VIP valet parking area, my midnight blue suit catching the ambient light of the street lamps. The relative silence of the night was suddenly shattered by a vicious, echoing shouting match. I stopped near the edge of the manicured hedges. A few yards away, standing beside their leased luxury sedan, were Cameron and Whitney. The polished veneer of their untouchable power couple persona had completely disintegrated. Cameron's expensive tuxedo jacket was thrown carelessly onto the dirty asphalt. He was waving his arms frantically, his face contorted in an ugly primal display of panic and rage. He screamed at Whitney, demanding to know how she could have possibly orchestrated a clandestine side negotiation with Bradley without telling him. He shouted that her reckless greed had single-handedly destroyed his career, his inheritance, and his legal freedom. Whitney did not cower or apologize. She stood her ground, her diamond necklace sparkling coldly as her chest heaved with venomous indignation. She spat back that Cameron was a spineless coward who lacked the inherent ruthlessness required to succeed in the high-stakes private equity world. She berated him for his constant hesitation, reminding him loudly that without her relentlessly pushing him forward, he would still be a middle management drone begging for scraps of authority. Their argument was a public, brutal autopsy of a marriage built entirely on mutual ambition and fundamental deceit. They hurled insults like weapons, entirely oblivious to the federal raid currently dismantling their lives just a few hundred feet away inside the building. I watched them tear each other apart, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. The son I had raised was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate stranger fighting over the ashes of his own hubris. Cameron suddenly stopped shouting. His frantic, wild gaze swept across the parking lot and locked instantly onto my figure standing quietly near the hedges. The raw, aggressive anger on his face melted into an expression of absolute, pathetic desperation. He stumbled away from his wife and sprinted across the asphalt toward me. He stopped a few feet away, panting heavily, his eyes wide with a manufactured, pleading innocence I had not witnessed since he was a child caught breaking a window. He reached out with trembling hands, desperate to grab my arms, but I took a single, deliberate step backward. The invisible boundary between us was absolute and unforgiving. Cameron began to babble the words spilling out of his mouth in a rapid, chaotic torrent. He begged me to call off Neil and contact the federal marshals to stop the investigation. He swore he never wanted to take the corporate dispute this far, claiming he had only agreed to the medical proxy because he was genuinely worried about my failing health. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger back at Whitney, who was watching us with folded arms and a sneer of profound disgust. Cameron insisted that his wife had actively brainwashed him. He claimed she poisoned his mind with relentless pressure, manipulating his natural ambition until he could no longer distinguish right from wrong. He pleaded with me to use my offshore capital and my immense legal leverage to stop the federal seizure. He promised he would divorce Whitney immediately, cut all ties with Apex Dynamics, and spend the rest of his natural life making amends for his disrespect. He asked me to save his life just one last time. I looked at the man sweating and shivering in front of me. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of paternal pity. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that cut cleanly through the crisp night air. I told him that an honorable man takes absolute responsibility for the knife he holds regardless of who whispered in his ear to use it. I reminded him that he was the one who walked into my bank with a forged medical document. He was the one who authorized a corrupt, sleazy doctor to drag me out of my own home in handcuffs. I looked at my son with pure ice. I delivered my final judgment. You traded my sanity for a corner office. You own this failure. The words struck him with physical force. His shoulders slumped heavily, and the last remnants of hope drained completely from his eyes as he realized his lifelong safety net was permanently severed. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed across the dark parking lot. Whitney walked slowly toward us, the sound of her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. She did not look like a woman whose corporate empire had just violently collapsed. She looked like an apex predator who had already secured her next meal. She stopped beside Cameron, shaking her head with profound, undisguised contempt. She looked down at her husband as if he were an insignificant insect. She laughed bitterly at his weakness, mocking his pathetic, crawling attempt to seek shelter from the father he had just actively tried to destroy. She told Cameron that his fundamental lack of spine was precisely why she had to secure her own financial future entirely independent of his failures. Cameron stared at her, completely bewildered by her terrifying calm, asking her what she was talking about. Whitney smiled a cold, victorious smile that seemed to freeze the surrounding air. She calmly informed him that while he was busy arguing with Bradley inside the ballroom, she had executed a massive, irreversible digital transfer. The $5 million Bradley had secured using my forged property deeds was not frozen by the federal marshals. Whitney revealed she had already intercepted the capital transfer and wired the entire sum directly into a private, completely untraceable banking account located in the Cayman Islands. She had actively anticipated Bradley's inevitable downfall and utilized the chaos of the federal raid to steal the emergency corporate funding entirely for herself. Cameron let out a strangled, breathless gasp, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her actions. He was now legally tied to a massive federal bank fraud. The company was destroyed, and the stolen capital was entirely gone. Whitney did not flinch at his profound horror. She reached up with a steady, unshakable hand and pulled the heavy diamond wedding ring from her finger. She looked at the sparkling stone for a brief, indifferent second before dropping it carelessly onto the asphalt between them. The metal clattered loudly against the ground, bouncing once before settling into the dirt. She told Cameron he was a terrible investment. She turned her back on him, adjusted her designer shawl, and walked gracefully away into the night, disappearing completely into the shadows of the city. I stood silently next to my son. He fell to his knees on the hard pavement, staring blankly at the discarded wedding ring. The trap he had built for me had sprung entirely on him, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable weight of his own consequences. Monday morning broke with a cold, unforgiving rain that perfectly mirrored the bleak, desolate reality facing my former family. Whitney wasted absolutely no time mourning the sudden death of her marriage or the spectacular public collapse of Apex Dynamics. She operated with the cold, calculating efficiency of a mercenary who knew exactly when a contract had expired. By dawn, she was already navigating the polished, brightly lit corridors of the international airport. She bypassed the standard security queues, utilizing her premium corporate status, carrying only a single piece of designer luggage. She clutched a first-class ticket to Geneva, fully intending to use a secondary connection to disappear completely into the European banking haven, where she believed her stolen millions waited securely. She sipped a complimentary espresso in the elite departure lounge, projecting an aura of untouchable superiority. She genuinely believed she had successfully outmaneuvered the federal government, Bradley, her husband, and me. Miles away from the airport, the situation was entirely different. Cameron was experiencing a complete, agonizing psychological unraveling. He paced frantically across the echoing marble floor of his primary corporate bank in the city center. His tailored suit from the charity gala was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He clutched a business card for the most expensive, aggressively ruthless criminal defense attorney in the state. The lawyer had demanded an exorbitant cash retainer up front before even considering looking at the massive federal indictment looming over my son. Cameron approached the teller window with violently shaking hands, demanding an immediate expedited wire transfer from his joint savings and investment portfolios. He needed hundreds of thousands of dollars liquidated instantly to build a legal firewall between himself and a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. He yelled at the bank teller to accelerate the process, slamming his open palm against the reinforced glass. He was terrified of the marshals knocking on his front door and desperate to purchase his salvation. Whitney was seeking a permanent escape while Cameron was desperately attempting to buy a temporary shield. Neither of them understood that the financial ground beneath their feet had already been completely removed. At the bank window, the teller typed Cameron's account numbers into the system, her expression shifting instantly from polite customer service to deep, silent alarm. She quietly excused herself and retrieved the senior branch manager. The manager approached Cameron with a grim, uncompromising posture and informed him that the wire transfer was universally declined. Cameron screamed, demanding to know exactly how a portfolio containing 7 figures of corporate compensation could be rejected. The manager coldly turned the computer monitor around. Every single account attached to Cameron's Social Security number, including his retirement funds, offshore investments, and joint checking, displayed an absolute, undeniable balance of 0. Cameron stared at the digital zeros, his breathing turning ragged and shallow as the blood drained completely from his face. Simultaneously, inside the quiet luxury of the airport lounge, Whitney pulled out her heavy metal Elite credit card to pay for an imported bottle of champagne before her boarding call. The bartender swiped the metal card, paused with a frown, and swiped it a second time. He quietly informed her that the transaction was entirely blocked. Whitney rolled her eyes, scoffed loudly at the perceived technical incompetence, and opened her encrypted banking application on her phone to verify her Cayman Island funds. The screen loaded slowly, eventually revealing an entirely empty ledger. The $5 million she had meticulously routed away from Apex Dynamics had completely vanished into thin air. They had severely underestimated Neil's surgical financial precision. The moment Dr. Aris confessed and the federal marshals seized the corporation, Neil immediately invoked the Elder Financial Abuse Act. Because the initial $5 million loan was secured using my forged medical proxy, the federal government legally classified the entire sum as capital stolen from a vulnerable senior citizen. This specific federal classification triggered a devastating immediate international response. It legally compelled foreign banking institutions to completely bypass standard jurisdictional red tape. The Cayman Bank had no choice but to comply with the emergency asset freeze and immediate financial clawback protocol. Neil tracked every single digital penny Whitney thought she had flawlessly laundered, reversing the wire transfers and draining their local accounts to compensate for the massive damages. The thieves had been completely stripped of their stolen wealth in a matter of hours. Whitney tapped her phone screen frantically, her polished fingernails clicking sharply against the glass as her heart began to pound a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She abandoned her champagne, grabbed her designer carry-on bag, and marched directly toward the boarding gate, determined to force her way onto the aircraft before the system caught up with her. She handed her passport to the gate agent, demanding immediate boarding access. The agent scanned the document, and a loud, sharp alarm echoed continuously from the terminal computer. The agent did not hand the passport back. Instead, she took a deliberate step backward and picked up a red emergency telephone. Whitney turned to run, but her carefully planned escape route was already permanently sealed. 4 heavily armed airport security officers, accompanied by 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers, surrounded her at the boarding gate. The lead agent loudly informed her that she was classified as an extreme flight risk, actively attempting to flee international jurisdiction while under a severe federal fraud investigation. Hundreds of passengers watched in stunned, absolute silence as the agent stripped Whitney of her expensive luggage, forced her hands behind her back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The ultimate corporate predator was publicly paraded through the crowded terminal like a common street thief. They escorted her away from the luxurious departure gates and into a stark, windowless concrete holding room deep within the bowels of the airport security annex. The federal agents systematically confiscated her jewelry, her leather belt, and her shoelaces, leaving her sitting alone on a cold metal bench. An agent placed a standard landline telephone on the metal table directly in front of her, informing her that she was granted one single monitored phone call before her permanent transfer to a federal detention facility. Whitney sat in the suffocating heavy silence. She knew Bradley was already locked in a federal cell facing decades of prison time. She knew Cameron was entirely broke, psychologically shattered, and utterly useless to her survival. She stared at the faded plastic keypad for a long, agonizing minute as her absolute defeat finally settled permanently into her bones. She picked up the heavy plastic receiver and dialed the only number left. Miles away. I sat in my quiet, dust-free study drinking a cup of dark black coffee. My personal cellular phone illuminated silently on the mahogany desk. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Whitney. I tapped the illuminated green icon on my cellular device and brought the speaker to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. The heavy, frantic breathing of my daughter-in-law filled the quiet space of my study. Whitney's voice, usually a weapon of sharp, calculated precision, was completely shattered. She was weeping loudly, the desperate sound bouncing off the cold concrete walls of the federal holding cell. She completely abandoned her sophisticated corporate persona and begged me for an immediate lifeline. She babbled incoherently about how the armed federal agents had confiscated her designer luggage, forcefully stripped her of her jewelry, and treated her like a common street criminal in front of hundreds of boarding passengers. She demanded to know how I had tracked the Cayman Island wire transfer, completely unable to process that my tactical reach infinitely exceeded her own. I let her cry into the receiver, sipping my black coffee in absolute silence. Her desperation quickly pivoted into a frantic, chaotic negotiation. She pleaded for a comprehensive legal settlement. She promised to fully cooperate with the authorities and testify extensively against Bradley in federal court. She swore she would turn over every piece of internal communication, every falsified corporate ledger, and every digital receipt detailing Apex Dynamics' long-term intellectual property theft. She frantically offered to personally wire the $5 million back into my account, completely unaware that Neil had already successfully executed the international clawback protocol hours ago. She believed she still held bargaining chips, clinging to the delusion that she was still a powerful negotiator rather than a defeated prisoner. She begged me to call my offshore legal team to contact the federal prosecutors and to personally drop the medical fraud charges against her. She claimed she was only looking out for Cameron's best interests, returning to the pathetic lie that her ruthless ambition was somehow rooted in familial preservation. Her voice pitched higher, cracking under the suffocating weight of her impending incarceration. She pleaded for mercy, demanding that I show the same quiet compassion I had always shown my son. I swallowed the last drop of my dark coffee and placed the ceramic mug deliberately onto the polished mahogany desk. I did not raise my voice or offer any trace of paternal sympathy. I spoke with absolute freezing clarity. I informed her that she possessed a fundamental misunderstanding of the current judicial reality. I explained that I was no longer the driving force behind her prosecution. The federal government had taken full autonomous control of the investigation the exact moment her forged medical proxy touched a federally insured commercial loan. I told her I possessed absolutely no legal authority to dismiss the charges, stop the marshals, or reverse the severe federal indictments she now faced. She had crossed a strict international financial boundary, and the Department of Justice did not negotiate with corporate parasites. Whitney gasped, her breathing hitching, as the inescapable permanence of her situation finally registered. She began to stammer, desperately searching for another angle of manipulation. I cut her off immediately. I instructed her to stop insulting my intelligence with empty promises and fabricated apologies. I reminded her of the specific, meticulous blueprints she had drafted for this very house. I detailed her exact calculated plan to sell my estate, liquidate my physical assets, and lock me away in a damp, unfinished basement, while she enjoyed the spoils of my lifelong engineering career. I reminded her of the suffocating scent of fresh paint and cheap linoleum she had ordered for that subterranean trap. I told her that she had actively plotted to strip away my fundamental human dignity for a temporary boost in her offshore portfolio. I stated explicitly that the cold, windowless federal detention cell she was currently sitting in was simply the architectural equivalent of the basement she had eagerly prepared for me. She had successfully built her own cage. I did not wait for her to formulate a final, pathetic response. I pressed the red icon on my screen, terminating the call and severing her final tether to the outside world. I placed the phone face down on the desk, sealing her permanently into the silence of her consequences. The profound quiet of the house lasted for exactly 3 minutes. I remained seated in my leather desk chair, letting the adrenaline of the final telephonic confrontation slowly dissipate into the calm evening air. Suddenly, a violent percussive crash shattered the tranquility of the estate. The distinct sound of heavy breaking glass echoed sharply from the second floor directly above my study. The noise was followed instantly by the heavy thud of a physical body tumbling awkwardly onto the hardwood floors of the master hallway. The motion-activated security sensors triggered immediately, bathing the upper landing in a harsh, bright light. I did not panic. I opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk and retrieved a heavy, solid steel flashlight. I moved silently out of the study and positioned myself at the base of the grand staircase. Heavy, erratic footsteps stomped recklessly across the floorboards above. I listened closely as the intruder violently kicked open the solid oak door to my private engineering drafting room. It was not a random, opportunistic burglary. The intruder was moving with desperate, targeted precision. I heard the sharp screech of metal tearing against wood as a heavy crowbar was used to ruthlessly pry open my locked, reinforced filing cabinets. I ascended the carpeted stairs with absolute stealth. I reached the second-floor landing and looked directly into the drafting room. Cameron was tearing the space apart. His suit jacket was ripped, his hands were bleeding heavily from scaling the exterior garden trellis, and his eyes were wild with sheer, unadulterated panic. He was frantically throwing hundreds of schematic folders onto the floor, desperately hunting for the original physical blueprints of my microchip patents. His bank accounts were at zero, his wife was in federal custody, and his corporate career was publicly destroyed. He was entirely out of time. The violent underground lenders he had borrowed from to fund his escalating hidden debts were no longer accepting corporate promises. They required immediate liquid capital. My son had broken into my home to steal the raw, physical paper documents, hoping to fence my life's work on the unregulated corporate black market to buy his physical survival. I stood silently in the doorway, letting the harsh security lights from the hallway cast long, sharp shadows across the drafting room. Cameron was violently ripping specialized architectural storage tubes from their wooden cubbies. He threw them aggressively onto the floor, stamping his heavy boots onto the protective plastic caps to break them open. Unfurled schematics of outdated robotic servos and obsolete manufacturing grids covered the hardwood floor like fallen snow. He was panting heavily, sweat dripping profusely from his forehead, his custom-tailored suit trousers utterly ruined by the thick white gypsum dust and scattered debris. He grabbed a solid brass paperweight from my desk and smashed it repeatedly against the lock of my primary mahogany filing cabinet. The expensive wood splintered violently with each frantic, desperate blow. He was a feral creature entirely consumed by the raw survival instinct of a cornered animal. I stepped fully into the room. The floorboards creaked softly under my leather shoes. He did not hear my approach over the chaotic, echoing noise of his own physical destruction. I reached out and pressed the wall switch, flooding the space with bright overhead illumination. Cameron froze instantly. The heavy brass paperweight slipped from his bloody fingers and hit the ground with a loud thud. He spun around his chest, heaving his eyes wide and severely bloodshot. He looked at me not with the polished arrogance of a corporate executive, but with the stark, unadulterated terror of a thief caught in the act. He took a rapid defensive step backward, his boot completely crushing a vintage hand-drawn schematic. He stammered frantically that he desperately needed the master patent files. He claimed he could sell the raw physical blueprints to overseas competitors to pay off the violent underground lenders who were currently hunting him for his massive unpaid gambling debts. He begged me to turn around and let him take the paper archives. He swore repeatedly that it was the absolute only way to keep himself out of a shallow grave. I did not move. I did not offer him a single inch of physical or emotional escape. I crossed my arms and watched him tremble under the bright lights. I informed him with freezing precision that my primary schematics had not existed on physical paper for over a decade. Every single proprietary design had been digitized and locked inside secure offshore servers managed entirely by Neil. He was tearing apart a useless museum of obsolete drafts. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he stared down at the ruined, worthless papers scattered around his feet. Cameron dropped heavily to his knees amid the shredded parchment. He desperately clawed through the torn documents, blindly hoping I was lying to protect the assets. I watched him systematically destroy the very space where I had engineered the financial foundation of his entire privileged life. I stepped closer, my shoes navigating the chaotic debris with measured steps. I told him to look closely around this room. I told him to look at the shattered architectural models and the splintered mahogany cabinets he had just destroyed. I asked him directly if this was the specific vision of legacy he had promised his mother he would protect. At the sudden mention of Evelyn, Cameron flinched violently as if struck by a live electrical wire. His frantic digging stopped entirely. I forced him to confront the agonizing memory he had deliberately buried beneath years of unchecked corporate greed. I reminded him of the sterile, brightly lit hospital room 20 years ago. I detailed the steady rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor measuring out the final fleeting hours of her life. I recounted exactly how she had held his trembling hand. Her physical grip incredibly weak, but her eyes fiercely determined. She had asked him for one single final promise before her heart stopped. She asked him to honor the family name, to protect the integrity of the enterprise we had built from absolute nothingness, and to stand loyally by my side. Cameron had stood beside that metal hospital bed, crying heavy tears, and swore a sacred, unbreakable oath to protect our legacy at all costs. I looked down at the pathetic, sweating man kneeling in the wreckage of my private sanctuary. I pointed to the heavy brass paperweight he had used to smash my cabinets. I told him that his mother would not even recognize the coward currently cowering on the floor. He had traded her final, dying wish for a temporary illusion of corporate power. He had sold out the family honor to impress a woman who abandoned him in an airport parking lot the very moment his bank accounts froze. Cameron pressed his bloody hands against his face and let out a raw, agonizing sob. The crushing weight of his absolute moral failure finally overpowered his sheer financial panic. He realized he had irreversibly destroyed his past, his present, and his future. Despite the overwhelming emotional collapse, a final desperate surge of survival instinct gripped my son. His bloodshot eyes darted toward the heavy steel door of my secondary wall safe, partially concealed behind a torn landscape painting he had knocked askew. It was an old mechanical decoy safe I kept specifically for highly personal records, entirely separate from any corporate data. Cameron lunged blindly toward the wall. He gripped his heavy steel crowbar tightly with both hands and swung it violently against the rotary dial. Metal sparked sharply against metal. The locking mechanism groaned and buckled under the sheer, panicked force of his adrenaline-fueled assault. He dropped the crowbar, ripped the heavy steel door open, and shoved his hands frantically inside the dark cavity. He expected to find a hidden cache of proprietary codes, emergency bearer bonds, or stacks of untraceable cash. Instead, his bleeding fingers pulled out a single thin leather binder. He ripped the binder open, his eyes scanning the thick yellowed parchment inside with manic intensity. I did not stop him. I stood completely still and watched him read the official stamped legal documentation from 40 years ago. The bold embossed text at the top of the page clearly stated it was a finalized decree of adoption. Cameron's breath hitched sharply in his throat. He looked up at me, his face utterly devoid of comprehension, and then looked rapidly back down at the paper. The document detailed his legal transfer from the state foster system into my immediate permanent care when he was just 2 years old. It explicitly stated that I had absolutely zero biological connection to him. Yet I had voluntarily given him my legal name. I had freely provided him with an elite education, unshakable financial security, and a lifetime of absolute unwavering protection. He realized in that agonizing fraction of a second that every single privilege he had ever experienced in his entire life was an unearned gift from a stranger who actively chose to love him as a son. The absolute staggering magnitude of his betrayal crashed down upon him. He had conspired to declare his savior mentally incompetent. He had actively plotted to steal the wealth of the only man who had ever chosen to rescue him from the void. The leather binder slipped from his shaking hands and landed softly on the pile of shredded blueprints. Cameron's legs finally gave out completely. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, curling into a tight, trembling ball amidst the ruined room. He wept with the absolute hollow devastation of a man who had actively burned down his only sanctuary. 72 hours after the devastating federal raid at the charity gala, the executive boardroom of Apex Dynamics smelled entirely of stale espresso, cold sweat, and profound corporate panic. Rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows of the 60th floor, casting long gray shadows across the sprawling mahogany conference table. Bradley stood at the head of the room looking absolutely nothing like the untouchable chief executive officer he had pretended to be just days prior. His designer suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His expensive silk tie was discarded on the floor, and deep dark circles severely bruised the skin beneath his frantic eyes. He was trapped in a rapidly shrinking box, bleeding capital by the second, and staring directly down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. Seated around the massive table were the 12 remaining members of the private equity board. They did not look at Bradley with respect or loyalty. They looked at him with the cold, calculating disgust of apex predators watching a wounded animal thrash in a steel trap. The federal injunction had completely frozen the company's primary operating accounts and forcefully halted all manufacturing lines across the globe. Apex Dynamics was actively suffocating. Bradley leaned heavily against the polished wood, his knuckles stark white, pleading with the hostile room for an immediate financial lifeline. He proposed a massive, unprecedented dilution of the company's remaining shares. He desperately needed to generate a sudden influx of liquid capital to pay off the impending Department of Justice penalties and secure a high-priced criminal defense team to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. He argued frantically that releasing millions of new shares at a fraction of their market value was the absolute only mathematical way to appease the federal prosecutors and unfreeze the core assets. The board members sat in heavy, judgmental silence, fully aware that diluting the shares would instantly wipe out their own financial equity. Bradley wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead and reminded them that without the cash injection, the company would be completely liquidated by the government within a single week. He demanded an emergency vote. He required an absolute supermajority of 75% to legally authorize the structural dilution. He slammed his fist against the mahogany wood, demanding blind loyalty from the executives he had previously made rich. The heavy, soundproof double doors of the executive boardroom suddenly unlatched with a loud, echoing mechanical click. The thick acoustic seals hissed sharply as the doors swung violently open, completely shattering the tense, suffocating silence of the emergency vote. I stepped across the threshold and walked deliberately into the room. I wore the exact same bespoke midnight blue suit I had worn to the hostile charity gala, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. My leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished marble perimeter of the room, a slow and deliberate cadence that commanded the immediate, unbroken attention of every single executive sitting at the table. Bradley stopped his frantic presentation mid-sentence, his jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table with both hands to keep his knees from buckling under the sudden crushing weight of his terror. A few agonizing seconds later, his shock violently mutated into a frantic, cornered rage. He pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at my chest and screamed at the top of his lungs. He ordered the 2 armed private corporate security guards standing near the presentation screens to forcefully remove me from the building immediately. He shouted that I was a trespassing lunatic, a bitter former employee who possessed absolutely no legal right to step foot inside the highly secure Apex Dynamics headquarters. The guards took a hesitant step forward, their hands resting cautiously on their tactical utility belts. I did not stop walking. I did not flinch, break eye contact, or offer a defensive posture. I maintained a steady, predatory approach toward the head of the long table. I looked directly at the security personnel and informed them that the corporation they were protecting was completely bankrupt. I explicitly stated that Bradley's operating accounts were federally frozen, meaning their premium security invoices would never be paid. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, exchanging a rapid, calculating look before taking a deliberate step backward, completely abandoning Bradley to his fast-approaching fate. I stopped at the edge of the mahogany table, directly opposite the hyperventilating chief executive officer. Neil stepped smoothly through the open doorway and flanked my right side. My offshore wealth manager moved with the quiet, lethal grace of an executioner arriving to perform a highly scheduled task. He did not offer a polite corporate greeting to the hostile room of private equity investors. Neil unclasped a slim leather portfolio, retrieved a single thick document bearing the heavy embossed seal of a certified international banking institution, and slid it forcefully across the smooth surface of the table. The heavy paper coasted precisely across the polished wood and came to an abrupt stop mere inches from Bradley's shaking hands. I leaned forward, planting my palms flat against the table, and commanded Bradley to read the official paperwork. He stared down at the financial ledger, his eyes darting frantically across the dense columns of transactional data. I did not wait for his compromised brain to process the complex mathematics. I explained the exact mechanics of the financial trap I had built. When the federal marshals publicly raided the gala and legally froze the company assets, the corporate valuation of Apex Dynamics instantly plummeted to pennies on the dollar. The institutional panic caused a massive, unprecedented sell-off of corporate bonds on the global market. While Bradley spent the entire weekend desperately hiding from federal subpoenas and fighting with his lawyers, Neil utilized my vast offshore capital to aggressively sweep the secondary debt markets. I informed the silent, captivated board of directors that I had successfully purchased exactly 51% of the company's severely distressed debt. I officially converted that leveraged debt into controlling equity at the opening of the European financial markets this very morning. I was no longer a discarded engineer or a hostile outsider to this firm. I was the absolute majority shareholder of Apex Dynamics. I held the permanent controlling voting rights. The supermajority Bradley so desperately needed to save his life now belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the ruined, sweating man at the head of the table. I informed him that his desperate motion to dilute the shares was officially denied. I fired him on the spot, stripped him of his executive corporate immunity, and left him entirely defenseless against the impending federal prosecution. Bradley's initial reaction was a complete and utter refusal to accept reality. He gripped the armrests of his plush leather chief executive officer chair so tightly that his knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. He remained seated, stubbornly anchoring himself to the physical symbol of his corporate dominance. He declared loudly that the emergency acquisition was entirely illegitimate and that I was nothing more than an obsolete relic trespassing in his domain. He screamed that he had personally built Apex Dynamics into a global powerhouse and that no amount of offshore capital would ever force him out of the room he commanded. I stood completely still, watching his polished facade disintegrate into the raw, desperate panic of a man watching his empire burn. When my absolute silence offered no opening for negotiation, Bradley finally snapped. The sheer terror of his impending federal imprisonment completely overrode his rational judgment. He vaulted over the heavy mahogany table, scattering files and shattering glass water pitchers in a sudden violent display of primal aggression. He raised his fist, screaming a chaotic torrent of physical threats determined to assault me right there in the boardroom. The private security guards remained firmly rooted by the doors, honoring my previous warning regarding the frozen corporate accounts. They did not move a single muscle to protect him. Instead, the intervention came from the most unexpected direction. The 12 board members, the very same men who had silently watched Bradley beg for a financial lifeline minutes earlier, instantly recognized the absolute shift in power. They knew I controlled their equity, their salaries, and their professional survival, moving with a synchronized, ruthless efficiency. 3 senior executives lunged forward and intercepted Bradley before he could reach my side of the table. They tackled their former leader with surprising physical force, grabbing his tailored lapels and slamming him brutally backward. They pinned his shoulders against the polished wood of the boardroom table, physically restraining the man they had once feared. They were aggressively sacrificing him to appease their new majority shareholder. Bradley thrashed wildly against the grip of his own board members, his face contorted in a mask of absolute betrayal and helpless rage. He was entirely neutralized by the very sycophants he had enriched. I looked down at the disgraced executive pinned against the mahogany surface, feeling absolutely no satisfaction or pity, only a cold, clinical necessity to finish the surgical extraction. Bradley stopped thrashing his chest, heaving rapidly as he stared up at me with venomous, bloodshot eyes. He realized physical intimidation was impossible, so he instantly pivoted back to his only remaining weapon. He demanded his money. He spat out that if he was being forcibly ousted from the corporation, he was legally entitled to the immediate payout of his executive severance package. He loudly reminded the boardroom that his contract guaranteed a massive $50 million golden parachute in the event of an involuntary termination. He sneered, claiming that my hostile takeover would at least fund his criminal defense and guarantee his luxurious lifestyle regardless of the federal charges. He genuinely believed that his wealth was untouchable, protected by the ironclad corporate bylaws he had meticulously drafted to shield himself from accountability. I did not blink. I signaled Neil with a slight, deliberate nod. My wealth manager stepped forward and opened his leather portfolio once again. He extracted a thick stack of federal indictments and internal audit reports, dropping them heavily onto Bradley's chest. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that carried perfectly across the silent room. I informed Bradley that standard severance packages were designed for executives who operated within the boundaries of the law. I detailed how his active participation in a massive intellectual property theft scheme completely breached his fiduciary duties. I outlined the exact timeline of his coordination with Cameron and Whitney to secure unauthorized capital using my forged medical proxy. I explained that this deliberate violation constituted gross misconduct and systemic corporate fraud of the highest federal order. Under the specific penalty clauses of the Securities and Exchange Commission, His actions legally voided every single protection woven into his employment contract. I officially terminated him for cause effective immediately. The $50 million golden parachute was entirely dissolved. He was completely stripped of his equity, his severance, and his accumulated stock options. The corporate safety net he had spent years weaving was permanently severed. I told him he was leaving the building with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the crushing weight of a federal indictment waiting for him at the lobby doors. Bradley's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. The utter totality of his financial ruin finally penetrated his arrogance. He yanked his arms free from the board members, straightening his ruined designer suit with trembling hands. He glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, refusing to accept total defeat. He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing harshly off the panoramic glass windows. He boasted that taking away his company and his capital would not stop him. He claimed he still possessed the greatest technological mind in the industry and the most aggressive contact list in the global market. He vowed to walk out of the building, secure private venture capital from his underground connections, and immediately launch a rival tech corporation. He promised to poach every single one of Apex Dynamics' major clients, replicate the manufacturing processes, and systematically drive my newly acquired company into permanent bankruptcy. He leaned heavily against the table, swearing that he would dedicate the rest of his natural life to destroying my legacy from the outside. I listened to his pathetic, desperate rant without breaking my icy composure. I reached into Neil's portfolio and withdrew a single laminated sheet of paper. I slid it slowly across the table until it rested directly in front of Bradley. It was a copy of his own original employment contract. I pointed directly to a heavily highlighted paragraph on the final page. I reminded Bradley that he had personally authored the most draconian, legally binding non-compete clause in the history of the tech sector. He had designed it specifically to trap his own subordinate engineers and prevent them from ever leaving his corporation to work for a competitor. He had proudly engineered an airtight legal cage to control his employees, and now, as the majority shareholder, I was legally activating that exact clause against him. I informed him that the contract explicitly banned him from operating consulting or participating in any technological enterprise anywhere on the globe for exactly 10 years. I told him that my offshore legal team was already mobilized to aggressively enforce the clause, ensuring he could not secure a single dime of investment capital without triggering an immediate catastrophic civil lawsuit. He was permanently locked out of the only industry he knew. Bradley stared down at his own signature, completely paralyzed by the realization that the very weapon he had built to destroy others had just finalized his own absolute destruction. The scheduled date for my formal competency hearing arrived on a bleak, overcast Thursday morning. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B swung open, revealing a space that smelled of lemon polish, aged paper, and impending doom. I walked into the room alongside Neil and my lead litigator, maintaining a posture of absolute, unshakable calm. Cameron and Whitney were escorted into the respondents' area shortly after. Whitney's expensive designer wardrobe had been entirely replaced by the stark, humiliating reality of federal custody. She wore a standard-issue, brightly colored prison jumpsuit, her wrists secured with heavy steel cuffs, until she was instructed to sit. Cameron walked completely hunched over, his eyes, hollow and vacant-looking, entirely like a man who had stared directly into the abyss of his own failures. The crushing revelation regarding his adoption had completely broken his spirit, leaving him a hollow shell of the arrogant executive he had pretended to be. Despite the catastrophic public collapse of their lives over the past week, their defense attorney had stubbornly refused to withdraw the original petition for my mental incapacitation. They genuinely believed that if they could somehow convince the presiding judge of my cognitive decline, they could retroactively invalidate my hostile takeover of Apex Dynamics and force the federal government to unfreeze their illicit offshore funds. It was a pathetic, transparent Hail Mary pass thrown by two desperate individuals actively drowning in the consequences of their own hubris. The judge, a stern, unforgiving magistrate with a fierce reputation for merciless efficiency, took his seat behind the elevated wooden bench. He peered down at the petitioners with visible disdain, clearly already briefed on the swirling federal indictments surrounding them. Cameron avoided my gaze entirely, staring fixedly at the scratches on the wooden table. Whitney, however, glared at me with a venomous, unyielding hatred. She still believed she was the smartest person in the room, clinging to the delusion that she could manipulate the judicial system to bend to her will. The bailiff called the courtroom to order and the final decisive battle over my autonomy officially commenced. The opposing counsel immediately called me to the witness stand, fully intending to cross-examine me into a state of visible confusion. They expected a fragile, disoriented old man to crumble under the aggressive pressure of rapid-fire legal questioning. I stood up, adjusted my tailored midnight blue suit jacket, and walked to the wooden enclosure with the steady, measured cadence of a predator circling its trapped prey. I placed my right hand on the Bible and swore the oath with a terrifying resonant clarity that immediately silenced the murmuring gallery. When their attorney began his aggressive interrogation regarding my recent massive financial maneuvers, I did not falter or hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I looked directly past him, focused entirely on the judge, and requested formal permission to submit physical evidence into the official court record. Neil approached the bench and handed the bailiff 3 thick, meticulously organized black binders. I spoke with absolute clinical precision. I did not sound like a man suffering from cognitive decline. I sounded like an executioner reading a final, inescapable verdict. I directed the judge to the first binder. It contained the exact comprehensive financial ledgers detailing Cameron and Whitney's massive, unsustainable private debts, unequivocally proving their sole motivation was sheer financial desperation rather than familial concern. I then directed the court to the second binder. I watched the remaining color drain completely from Whitney's face as I explicitly detailed the sworn notarized confession from Dr. Aris. The corrupt physician had completely folded under federal pressure, explicitly outlining how Whitney had bribed him to forge my medical proxy in exchange for a lucrative percentage of the stolen capital. Finally, I instructed the judge to open the third binder. I read aloud the printed, encrypted chat logs Neil had expertly extracted from their personal mobile devices. The transcripts detailed their exact step-by-step conspiracy to strip my corporate assets, sell my family estate, and lock me away in a damp, unfinished basement. Every single keystroke of their malicious plot was now a matter of permanent, undeniable public record. The opposing counsel stood frozen in the center of the room, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He possessed absolutely no defense against the crushing mountain of empirical truth I had just dropped onto the courtroom floor. I looked directly at my son, who had buried his face entirely in his trembling hands, entirely unable to look at the man who had given him everything. The presiding judge stared at the meticulously organized binders for a long, agonizing minute. The heavy silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing emanating from Cameron's side of the table. The judge slowly removed his reading glasses, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked down at the petitioners not as citizens seeking a legitimate legal remedy, but as a severe infection that needed to be surgically and permanently removed from his courtroom. He lifted his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a violent, echoing crack that made Cameron physically jump in his seat. The judge announced in a booming, authoritative voice that the petition for my mental incapacitation was officially and permanently dismissed with extreme prejudice. He explicitly stated for the public record that I possessed a level of cognitive acuity and strategic brilliance that far surpassed anyone else sitting in the room. He did not stop there. He fixed his furious, unwavering gaze directly on Whitney and Cameron. He declared that he had never witnessed such a repulsive, calculating display of elder financial exploitation in his entire judicial career. He ordered the opposing counsel to sit down and remain completely silent. The judge then announced that he was invoking his immediate judicial authority to completely transform the nature of the proceedings. He officially converted the civil competency hearing into an active, mandatory criminal arraignment. He instructed the 2 armed federal marshals standing at the rear of the courtroom to step forward and immediately secure the defendants. The marshals moved with swift tactical efficiency, grabbing Cameron by the shoulders and pulling him forcefully to his feet alongside his wife. The judge looked down at the shattered couple and formally charged them both with multiple federal counts of felony elder abuse, aggravated identity theft, and grand corporate fraud. He denied bail outright, citing their documented status as severe flight risks and their blatant ongoing attempts to manipulate the judicial system for financial gain. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around Cameron's wrists, echoing the exact metallic sound of the cell doors that would soon lock them away for decades. They were aggressively marched out of the courtroom, leaving me sitting in absolute undisputed victory. The trap they had spent months meticulously building for me had just violently snapped shut entirely on their own necks. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the Federal Detention Center's visitation room offered no shadows for Whitney to hide behind. 72 hours after her spectacular public arrest in the courtroom, the reality of mandatory federal and state prison sentences had completely decimated her arrogant facade. She sat across from me at the bolted metal table wearing an oversized faded orange jumpsuit that swallowed her shrinking frame. Her designer makeup had long since washed away, revealing the deep, dark bags of profound exhaustion and absolute terror beneath her eyes. Her court-appointed public defender sat silently beside her, completely outmatched and outgunned by Neil and the relentless legal machinery I had brought into the room. Whitney did not wait for her lawyer to formally open the negotiations. She leaned forward, her wrists restricted by the heavy metal chain bolted to the table, and began to weep. The tears flowed freely down her pale cheeks, a desperate, hyperventilating display of manufactured remorse. She sobbed that she had been entirely brainwashed by Bradley's corporate promises and heavily manipulated by Cameron's financial panic. She begged me to leverage my newfound absolute authority over Apex Dynamics and my immense capital to broker a settlement completely outside the courtroom. She frantically promised that if I instructed the federal prosecutors to drop the felony elder abuse and grand fraud charges against her, she would immediately turn state's evidence. She offered to stand before a federal grand jury and ruthlessly testify against Bradley, swearing to expose every hidden offshore account, every falsified corporate ledger, and every illegal wire transfer he had ever authorized. She pleaded for her freedom, promising she would walk away completely empty-handed, divorce my son, and disappear from my life permanently. She swore she would sign over any remaining hidden assets, surrender her passport, and submit to lifetime probation. She detailed how her testimony was the absolute silver bullet the prosecution needed to permanently bury Bradley, attempting to position herself as a vital, indispensable asset to my ultimate revenge. She babbled incoherently about how she was a victim of toxic corporate culture, desperately attempting to shift the entirety of the blame onto the men she had actively manipulated. She clutched her shackled hands together, crying out that a woman of her pedigree would never survive a decade inside a maximum security penitentiary. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, desperately hoping to find a single lingering shred of the paternal benevolence she had spent the last year actively trying to exploit and destroy. I sat perfectly still, my posture completely relaxed against the rigid metal chair. I watched her theatrical performance with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. I let her tears fall onto the scratched metal table, offering absolutely no tissue, no comforting words, and no trace of human empathy. When her frantic sobbing finally dissolved into a breathless, pathetic silence, I spoke with lethal, unwavering precision. I informed her that I possessed zero interest in her fabricated apologies or her sudden, self-serving victimhood. I explicitly reminded her that she was the primary architect of the forged medical proxy. She was the one who had meticulously measured my home for a basement confinement, and she was the one who had actively intercepted the $5 million in stolen capital during the charity gala raid. I told her that her tears were nothing more than the biological response of a cornered predator realizing the trap was permanently locked. The federal prosecutors already possessed Dr. Aris's sworn confession, the encrypted chat logs, and the explicit financial wire traces. They absolutely did not need her testimony to secure Bradley's conviction. They already had him dead to rights, completely neutralizing her final bargaining chip. Whitney's breathing hitched violently as the last remaining pillar of her leverage instantly evaporated. I leaned across the cold metal table, my voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register. I informed her that the federal prosecutor, out of sheer respect for my status as the primary victim, had agreed to entertain one single, highly specific plea arrangement drafted entirely on my terms. I was perfectly willing to recommend a suspended sentence and protect her from spending the next 20 years rotting inside a violent, concrete federal cell alongside the very criminals she used to mock. However, this recommendation was absolutely non-negotiable and carried a price far heavier than a simple prison sentence. I told her she was going to pay for her catastrophic greed, using the very currency she valued most, her untouchable pride, her manicured vanity, and her unearned social status. I made it abundantly clear that any deviation, any hesitation, or any attempt to negotiate the terms would result in my immediate withdrawal of the offer. If she refused my specific parameters, I would personally ensure the prosecution sought the absolute maximum penalty allowed under federal guidelines, guaranteeing she would lose the best years of her life behind razor wire. Neil unlatched his leather portfolio and slid a thick, legally binding settlement agreement across the metal table. I instructed Whitney to read the exact terms of her salvation. The first unalterable condition required her to stand in open court and deliver a full, unredacted, and highly publicized confession on the official judicial record. She was legally mandated to admit her specific role in the elder abuse conspiracy, the fraud, and the intellectual property theft, entirely destroying her professional reputation and high society standing permanently. The second condition outlined a ruthless, ironclad financial penalty. For the next 10 consecutive years, 90% of her gross income would be subject to a mandatory immediate wage garnishment to repay the massive legal fees and corporate damages she had directly caused. She would be allowed to retain only the absolute bare minimum required by federal law for basic human survival. Whitney stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing in mute, paralyzed horror. I then pointed to the final, most crucial paragraph of the binding agreement. Because she was now an officially convicted felon with massive court-ordered restitution, she required immediate, verifiable employment to satisfy the judge. I informed her that as the new majority shareholder of Apex Dynamics, I had personally arranged for her mandatory job placement. She was legally bound to accept a minimum wage third-shift janitorial position at the exact corporate headquarters she had previously plotted to conquer. For the next decade, she would spend her nights wearing a coarse industrial uniform, scrubbing the toilets, polishing the marble floors, and emptying the trash cans inside the executive boardroom she had once believed she rightfully owned. If she missed a single shift, violated a single corporate protocol, or attempted to quit, the suspended sentence would trigger instantly, and she would be transferred directly to a federal penitentiary. Whitney looked down at the contract, her hands trembling violently as the sheer, inescapable totality of her permanent humiliation washed over her. Stripped of all leverage, completely bankrupt, and facing a decade of grueling manual labor under my absolute command, she picked up the black ink pen. She signed her name on the dotted line, finalizing her own brutal penance and officially surrendering her life to the man she had tried to erase. The heavy metal chains rattled loudly against the table as she pushed the signed document back toward Neil. She did not look up. She simply stared at her own signature, completely broken by the realization that she would spend the next 10 years physically cleaning up the wreckage of her own arrogance, entirely invisible and completely powerless. The relentless driving storm outside mirrored the total, absolute devastation of Cameron's corporate life. The federal judge had shown a microscopic fraction of leniency during the final sentencing phase, granting my son a severely restrictive, strictly monitored 5-year probation instead of a concrete federal cell. That fragile judicial mercy, however, did not extend to his financial survival. The government asset forfeiture unit had aggressively and systematically seized his downtown penthouse, his luxury imported vehicles, his hidden offshore accounts, and every single piece of designer furniture he possessed to satisfy the massive restitution orders. He was completely, unequivocally bankrupt. He possessed absolutely no credit score, no corporate contacts willing to answer his desperate calls, and no social safety net to catch his spectacular fall from grace. Whitney was already serving her own specialized sentence, spending her nights scrubbing the floors of my corporate headquarters, leaving Cameron entirely isolated and defenseless. I sat in the quiet warmth of my primary study, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the heavy rain against the reinforced glass windows. The peaceful silence of the estate was abruptly shattered by a heavy, hesitant knock at the front door. The low chime of the security system alerted me to a presence on the front porch. I stood up, smoothing the cuffs of my tailored shirt, and walked deliberately toward the grand entryway. I looked through the high-resolution security monitor before reaching for the heavy brass handle. Standing under the freezing downpour, completely soaked to the bone, was Cameron. He wore a cheap, oversized gray sweatshirt and heavily stained denim jeans, a jarring, pathetic departure from the bespoke silk suits he had flaunted just weeks ago. His shoulders were severely hunched against the biting wind, and he shivered uncontrollably under the unforgiving storm. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy black plastic trash bag. It contained the absolute entirety of his remaining worldly possessions. He did not look like an apex corporate predator or a ruthless private equity executive. He looked exactly like a broken, desperate transient begging for a temporary reprieve from the harsh elements. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. The freezing wind immediately whipped through the foyer, carrying the sharp scent of wet asphalt and bitter defeat. Cameron did not speak. He simply stood on the soaked welcome mat, his hollow, bloodshot eyes staring down at his ruined shoes. The deafening silence between us carried the immense, crushing weight of his absolute betrayal and his catastrophic failure. I looked at the broken man standing on my doorstep, clinically analyzing the shattered remnants of the son I had meticulously raised, protected, and educated. I felt absolutely no paternal urge to comfort him, to wrap a warm blanket around his shivering shoulders, or to offer empty words of consolation. I stepped backward, opening the door just wide enough for him to cross the threshold. I did not invite him into the warmth of the primary living room or direct him toward the luxurious guest suites on the second floor. I simply turned my back on him and began walking down the long, shadowed corridor leading toward the rear utility wing of the estate. I heard the wet, heavy squeak of his ruined sneakers following obediently behind me, trailing a steady stream of cold rainwater across the polished hardwood floors. I reached the heavy reinforced door at the dead end of the hall. I turned the cold iron handle and pulled it open, revealing the steep, narrow wooden staircase descending directly into the subterranean level of the house. I flipped the wall switch. A single harsh fluorescent bulb flickered to life with a low mechanical hum, casting sterile, unforgiving shadows across the damp concrete walls below. I walked down the stairs, listening closely as Cameron followed my exact path. We reached the bottom and stepped onto the cheap, peeling linoleum flooring. The air down here was thick, carrying the distinct, suffocating scent of stale moisture-exposed fiberglass insulation and fresh toxic paint. This was the exact windowless containment zone Whitney had eagerly prepared for me weeks ago. She had meticulously measured these very walls, calculating exactly how to lock me away in a forgotten corner of my own home while she violently liquidated my life's work. The space was entirely barren, featuring only a stained utility sink, a single exposed pipe dripping cold water, and a rusted metal cot pushed against the far cinder block wall. Cameron stared at the bleak subterranean prison, his jaw trembling violently as the profound realization of his new reality finally settled completely into his mind. He looked around the damp freezing room, fully comprehending that the psychological trap he had actively helped build for me was now his permanent, inescapable sanctuary. I walked over to the dark corner of the unfinished basement and picked up a heavy industrial push broom leaning against the exposed cinder block. I carried it back across the cheap linoleum floor and stopped directly in front of Cameron. He stood perfectly still, his wet clothes clinging miserably to his shivering frame, clutching his black plastic trash bag like a pathetic physical shield. I held the thick wooden handle of the broom out toward him. I did not offer any trace of anger, vindictiveness, or malice in my voice. I spoke with the cold, absolute authority of a judge delivering a final, unalterable sentence. I informed him that the luxurious safety net he had aggressively exploited for his entire life was permanently dismantled. I stated explicitly that he was no longer a privileged guest in my home, nor was he an entitled heir to my vast estate. I told him that he was now a tenant operating under the strictest possible conditions. He would live entirely within the rigid boundaries of these concrete walls. He would pay a mandatory monthly rent calculated exactly at the current market rate for an industrial basement unit. Because his extensive criminal record and public disgrace rendered him completely unemployable in the corporate sector, he would work directly for me to generate his capital. I told him he would earn his daily meals through grueling, relentless manual labor around the estate, maintaining the expansive grounds, scrubbing the exterior masonry, and physically repairing the massive structural damage he had previously caused to my drafting room. If he failed to complete his assigned tasks with absolute perfection, he would not eat. If he failed to pay his rent on time, he would be immediately evicted onto the street, where the federal probation officers would inevitably find him in direct violation of his release terms, sending him straight to a maximum security cell. I pushed the wooden handle closer to his chest. I told him he had to make a choice right now. Cameron stared at the rough wood. He did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate the harsh terms or beg for a single shred of leniency. He slowly released his grip on the trash bag, letting it drop heavily onto the damp floor. He raised his trembling, blistered hands and wrapped his fingers tightly around the wooden handle of the broom. He lowered his head in absolute, unbroken submission, accepting his grueling penance without speaking a single word of protest. The crisp, cool air of early autumn had finally settled over the estate, bringing with it a profound stillness that stood in sharp contrast to the corporate bloodletting of the previous month. I was in the greenhouse meticulously pruning a row of hybrid orchids, when the sharp crunch of tires on the gravel driveway interrupted my solitary routine. A sleek black town car parked near the main entrance. A young, sharply dressed executive stepped out clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest. His name was Marcus, a brilliant and uncorrupted protege handpicked by Neil to assist in the massive restructuring of Apex Dynamics. I wiped the dark soil from my hands, removed my gardening gloves, and walked out to meet him on the front porch. Marcus did not offer a casual greeting. He possessed the frantic, high-voltage energy of a man actively navigating a corporate war zone. He followed me into the primary study, immediately unpacking the mountain of legal documents onto the heavy mahogany desk. He explained that the transitional board of directors had successfully stabilized the company's stock, completely excised Bradley's remaining loyalists, and initiated the arduous process of rebuilding the global supply chains. However, Marcus had arrived with an ulterior motive. He leaned across the polished wood, his voice carrying a note of genuine desperation. He explicitly begged me to return to the corporate headquarters and formally assume the title of Chief Executive Officer. He argued that the international markets required a visionary leader to restore absolute consumer confidence and that my immediate reinstatement would instantly skyrocket the corporate valuation. He painted a vivid, enticing picture of total industry dominance. I stood by the reinforced glass window looking out over the sprawling green lawns of my property. The internal conflict was immediate but surprisingly brief. A part of me, the ambitious architect who had originally built the empire from nothing, felt the undeniable magnetic pull of corporate power. I possessed the absolute authority to march back into that 60th floor boardroom, sit in the executive chair, and publicly rule the massive global entity I had rightfully conquered. I could wield that immense capital like a weapon, dictating terms to the very industry that had attempted to erase me. Yet as I listened to Marcus outline 10-year growth projections and aggressive expansion strategies, the allure of that relentless high-stakes battlefield felt entirely hollow. I turned away from the window and walked back to the heavy mahogany desk. I looked directly at the young, ambitious executive standing before me. I informed Marcus that my war was officially over. I had absolutely no desire to spend the remaining years of my life trapped inside a sterile glass tower, trading my hard-won peace for quarterly earnings reports and endless shareholder meetings. My objective had never been to reclaim the suffocating burden of daily corporate management. My singular goal had been the complete and permanent eradication of the parasites who had attempted to steal my legacy. I picked up my favorite black ink pen and pulled the stack of foundational patent transfers toward me. These documents represented the core technological heartbeat of Apex Dynamics, the exact intellectual property that Bradley and Whitney had sacrificed their freedom to steal. Without a single fraction of hesitation, I signed my name across the bottom of each page. I legally transferred the absolute controlling rights to a blind trust managed by the newly appointed, rigorously vetted board of directors. I engineered an unbreakable corporate charter prioritizing ethical manufacturing, sustainable growth, and aggressive employee protections. I explicitly stripped the executive branch of the predatory golden parachutes and stock dilution loopholes that had allowed men like Bradley to thrive. I handed the signed documents back to Marcus formally and permanently, refusing the position of Chief Executive Officer. I told him he possessed the drive, the uncorrupted ethics, and the stamina required to lead the corporation into the future. I instructed him to return to the city, deliver my final proxy votes to the board, and execute the restructuring plan exactly as we had designed it. Marcus stared at the signed patents in his hands, completely stunned by my willing abdication of absolute power. He respectfully closed his briefcase, nodded with profound gratitude, and promised that my vision would be executed flawlessly. I watched him leave the study, feeling an immense crushing weight lift completely from my shoulders. I had built the machine, I had purged it of its fatal infections, and now I was officially walking away on my own terms. I chose the quiet rhythm of my garden over the chaotic, endless demands of the boardroom. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, leaving the massive house in total, undisturbed tranquility. I walked slowly through the long, sunlit corridors toward the kitchen, my footsteps producing a steady, comforting rhythm against the polished hardwood floors. I poured myself a single cup of black coffee from the French press, letting the bitter, familiar aroma fill the quiet space. I pushed open the sliding glass doors and stepped out onto the expansive back porch. The early morning storm had completely broken, leaving the air sharp, clean, and vibrant. The sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of my estate. The complex network of security cameras hummed silently along the perimeter, securing a fortress that was now entirely impenetrable. My offshore accounts were heavily fortified, insulated by layers of encrypted international law. My legacy was secure, managed by individuals who operated under my strict moral parameters. I took a slow sip of the dark coffee, savoring the profound, absolute silence of a life entirely free from parasitic attachments and manufactured affection. Out of the corner of my eye, a steady, rhythmic movement broke the stillness of the property. I looked toward the long, winding asphalt driveway. Cameron was outside. He wore the same coarse, heavy canvas work jacket I had provided him, his head bowed against the morning chill. He held the heavy industrial push broom with blistered, calloused hands, methodically sweeping the wet leaves and storm debris from the pavement. He moved with a slow, deliberate obedience fully broken of his previous arrogance. He did not look up at the rising sun. He did not look toward the warm, brightly lit windows of the primary house. He simply focused entirely on the rough asphalt beneath his feet, earning his daily rations through silent, grueling labor. I watched the man I had raised perform his mandatory chores without a single ounce of pity or regret. The sprawling estate was pristine, the corporate empire was purged, the debts of betrayal had been aggressively and permanently collected. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the warm morning sunlight wash over my face. The grand adjustment was finally complete, and absolute order was permanently restored. The most profound power does not roar. It observes, calculates, and strikes with absolute precision. Betrayal from those we nurture is the deepest wound, but it must never dictate our ruin. True strength lies in the silent adjustment, stripping away emotional vulnerabilities to execute a flawless, unyielding defense. Money and status cannot buy loyalty or shield the corrupt from the inevitable consequences of their own arrogance. Reclaiming your dignity requires patience and the ruthless elimination of toxic attachments. Ultimately, genuine peace is not passively found. It is aggressively built on the eradicated ambitions of those who sought to destroy you. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Share your stories of setting strict boundaries to protect your peace, and let me know which city you are tuning in from. I look forward to reading your comments, and we'll see you in the next story.